Chapter 892. Amandina, you open it. Brando looked at the box and said. Amandina was stunned for a moment before she reacted. She looked at her lord carefully, feeling a little touched, and then nodded gently. She placed her hand on the cold iron box and suppressed the excitement in her heart. She chanted the incantation in a low voice. Word by word came out from her soft lips, low and clear. The lock of the box seemed to be lifted by an invisible hand, and then quietly slid open. Finally, it fell to the ground with a bang. She took a deep breath and slowly opened the box. Below was a layer of waterproof tarpaulin, and under the tarpaulin were 3 tightly bundled packages. The wrappers were also made of the same tarpaulin material, and on top of the packages was a letter. The seal on the letter was also printed with the emblem they had seen before. Amandina opened the envelope and carefully read through the contents of the letter. The contents of the letter were similar to the will. If someone else found this inheritance, he hoped that the person who found it would split it into 3 parts. He would be able to inherit the richest part, while the other 2 parts and some miscellaneous items would be left to Amandina and Sadie. At least they would have something to rely on in life, and at the same time it would also be a memento. There were also some words left for Amandina in the letter, probably hoping that she could be happy and forgive his irresponsible father. After reading the last sentence, Amandina held the letter with both hands for a long time without saying a word. She lowered her head, and her thick eyelashes trembled slightly like feathers. Brando and Freya looked at each other behind her. The future Valkyrie's eyes were full of sympathy, and she almost wanted to share the sorrow in Amandina's heart. She thought of her own background, and her heart also softened. After a while, Amandina put down the letter. She looked as if nothing had happened, but her face was frighteningly pale. My lord, let's open these packages. Seeing her like this, Brando couldn't bear to say anything, so he just nodded. He suddenly wondered if he had really made the right decision to come here. He thought that Amandina had long forgotten the haze of the past, but he didn't expect that these sorrows were buried so deep in her heart. Amandina opened the largest package first, and the gold and silver rays immediately illuminated the 3 of their faces. There were gold bars and silver ingots neatly stacked together, along with some jewels and deeds to houses and lands. Amandina quickly estimated that there were at least 100,000 tors worth of wealth, which was a large sum of money for a small noble family. However, this money was prepared by her father for the person who discovered the inheritance. Amandina silently put it aside and opened the second package. The second parcel contained similar items, but the amount was only half of the first parcel. This parcel was for her mother. There was also a letter signed by Sadie, her mother. Amandina did not open the envelope. Instead, she stared at the letter for a long while before putting it down gently. Then she picked up the third parcel. This was the smallest parcel, about the size of a dressing box. This parcel was left for her. When she held the parcel, she almost suffocated, but she still held her breath and carefully opened it. She separated the layers of oiled paper, and inside was an exquisite walnut box. When she opened the box again, there was a ring and a thin necklace on top of the velvet cloth. The moment she saw the necklace, she couldn't help but cry. Brando and Freya looked at the necklace in silence. It turned out that the crystal pendant of the necklace was a beautiful recording crystal. When the box was opened, the crystal shone and reflected a man and a woman standing side by side. The man had a head of black hair, and his face vaguely resembled Amandina's. He smiled gently at Amandina. Anna, if there is a day when you open this box with your own hands, I believe that at this time I will already be dead. My beloved daughter, I dare not ask for your forgiveness as an irresponsible father, but please believe that your father's life is to pursue the most righteous and just things in this world. Because I know that a person who takes responsibility for this world will never be a sinner. Anna, I hope that there will be a day when you can use your clear eyes to see the truth of this world, and not be blinded by falsehood. Because you are so intelligent, you are my pride. This ring is the token of my engagement with your mother. After obtaining your mother's permission, I will leave it here. I hope that one day it can be a witness to your happiness to your other half. Anna, the gentlewoman who resembled Amandina said with a smile, I hope that one day, you'll be able to find your own happiness. Liar. Amandina sobbed. as if the emotions that she had been suppressing were finally bursting out like a flood that had broken through a dam. Her beast-like whimpers finally turned into howls of pain. Brando had never seen his quiet and calm Amandina reveal such a side to him. She was as helpless as a child, her weak shoulders trembling, as if she could not make any other sound other than crying. Brando was also choked with sobs. In this world there were some emotions that could always move people's hearts, and hit the softest part of people's hearts. Family was undoubtedly the kind of emotion that could never be cut off. No matter how strong and indifferent she appeared in his eyes, as if she had already forgotten everything in the past, in front of her parents, she was still crying like a child. She was not biting her lips and tears were welling up in her eyes, but she had completely lost her voice and cried out like a wild beast. Freya also turned her head and wiped the corners of her eyes with her hand. She did not know how much time had passed. Amandina finally sorted out her feelings. She blushed and tried not to look at Freya and Brando, as if she was afraid of being seen by them as a joke. "My lord, I have checked carefully. It seems that there are no relics of Lord Darius here." As soon as she opened her mouth, her face could not help but turn even redder. Because her voice was so hoarse it was almost like a different person was speaking. Brando looked at her with some concern and asked, "Are you okay, Amandina?" Amandina shook her head and sighed softly. Her heart was in a mess and for a moment, she could not tell if she was really okay or not. But in any case, after getting the things that her father left for her, the hatred in her heart for her father who left without saying goodbye seemed to be less intense. She silently thought that perhaps when her mother was holding her hand on the sickbed, she already knew where her father had gone. They had always known, because her father had never lied to her mother. They just worked together to deceive her. She smiled, then shook her head gently. Although the tears still hung on her cheeks, Amandina's smile was very cute. Brando finally breathed a sigh of relief. He looked at Freya, and the kind-hearted girl of Bucci also breathed a sigh of relief. There were no relics of Darius in the box, which was completely opposite to what was written in the letter. This was both within and outside of Brando's expectations. He thought for a moment before answering. "Amandina, your father could not guarantee that the person who unearthed his inheritance would be you, nor could he guarantee that the person who unearthed it would keep his promise to give the inheritance to you and your mother, so it is unlikely that he would put such an important thing directly in the inheritance." Amandina nodded her head. "But he clearly wrote in the letter." Freya asked with some confusion. "That was a private letter, there was no need for him to lie, right?" She immediately understood and said, "I understand there was no need for him to put Lord Darius' relics in his own inheritance, but he could have left clues in the inheritance." Brando looked at her with some surprise. "How did you suddenly become so smart?" Freya gritted her teeth and glared at him. "If my father left a message for me in the inheritance, I think it can only be in my package." Amandina thought for a moment and replied, "But isn't it possible that it was in your mother's package?" Freya turned back and asked again. Amandina shook her head. "My mother's package was basically filled with valuables. My father would definitely take into account the greed of people, and only the inheritance that he left for me was almost all miscellaneous things that wouldn't attract attention. Moreover, I've also checked my mother's package before, and that letter, there was nothing in it that was worth paying attention to." "Amandina, you guessed it a long time ago, you're really smart," Freya said with some envy. She was never the smartest one in the Knight Academy, and could even be said to be a little stupid. But for those who were truly talented, she only envied and did not have the slightest bit of jealousy. The princess told her that her father was the most talented knight lord in Erwin's previous era, which made her very distressed. Why was she so clumsy? Amandina smiled slightly. "Have you checked it?" Brando asked again. Amandina nodded. "I've checked the necklace, the ring, and the box inside and out, but I didn't find any clues." She thought for a moment and replied, "I don't think my father would leave such important information in a conspicuous place. I'm afraid only by taking them apart will I be able to find out where the clues are." "But that's the last thing your father left for you." "It's okay, my lord," Amandina replied softly. "This is also my father's wish, he won't blame us for this. Besides, if we miss someone, we should keep it in our hearts and not be entangled in these external things." She opened the box, but Brando held her hand. "I'll do it," he said. "Show me the necklace." Amandina was slightly startled. She raised her head and looked at her lord, then nodded and put the necklace in his hand. Brando took the necklace and carefully examined it. Then he pinched the pendant of the necklace and gently turned it. After only a moment, the pendant really did loosen. He dropped the pendant in a certain direction, then carefully held it up to the light in the room, and then pulled out a wrapped piece of paper from it. His actions were without the slightest hesitation, as if he had planned all of this in advance and had already guessed that the note was hidden in the necklace. Freya and Amandina, who were next to him, were completely stunned. My lord?" Amandina's mouth was slightly open. She almost thought that her lord was an omniscient and omnipotent god. Recording crystals had a physical characteristic. Their crystal structure was hollow. Brendel had thought of this when he checked the necklace, and he tried to remove the pendant from the necklace. He did not expect to succeed in one try, and he found the key to the pendant. This was also a coincidence. He handed the necklace over to Amandina and explained the reason to her with a wry smile. Amandina finally understood the reason, but she still looked at her lord with great respect. Amandina was a researcher of magicite runes, so she was most familiar with all kinds of crystals. However, the recording crystal was a rare item because it was a man-made magic crystal. There were very few people who truly understood its physical properties. Only her lord, who was so knowledgeable that it was almost unheard of, was able to use it so easily. The three of them opened the note and found that there were some strange symbols drawn on it. It was like a child's scribbles. Brando and Amandina did not understand what it was at first, but Freya said softly, "Ah, this is a military secret rune." "Military secret rune?" Brando was slightly surprised. He knew that there were often secret messages that needed to be passed on in the military. Every country had a set of secret symbols that were modified from ancient runes. He was very familiar with Erwin's military secret runes, whether it was the Anson secret runes from 30 years ago or the new secret runes after the Great Frost upheaval. He could decipher them, but the ones in front of him were obviously not any of them. He looked at Freya with a questioning gaze, and the future goddess of war nodded affirmatively at him. "This is the military secret rune of the Cruise people, and it's an old secret rune from half a century ago. I just happened to learn it in the Royal Academy." Amandina also realized what she was talking about. "Yes," Amandina replied as if she had recalled something. "When I was young, my father taught me some of this secret rune, but he did not tell me what it was at that time." Brando did not expect Freya to have learned the secret rune of the Cruise people. He immediately asked, "Can you decipher it?" Freya read it carefully and nodded. "It's not a big problem, Brando. This looks like a map." "What are these?" There were three things in front of Freya: a light gray crystal, some reddish-brown stone pieces, and a papyrus map with only a few lines. These three things were taken out from the same iron box. This box was taken out from under the floor of an old house in Hood after she deciphered the secret rune. Of course, she did not recognize any of them. Brando thought of a way to get Dian to spend some money to smuggle out the inheritance from her father's tomb. He cast an elemental protection spell on the box so that those people would not be able to open it. There was a lot of work going in and out of the tomb, and the wizards who secretly practiced dark magic would not bring out the corpses one by one, so it was not strange that they used a box. Brando was originally worried that it would arouse suspicion, but he underestimated the extent to which these things were common in the eyes of grave robbers. After the gravekeeper received a sum of money from Dian, he patted his chest and promised that it would not be a problem if he wanted to carry a few coffins out of the tomb, let alone a box. Then he found some nimble people from God knows where. In Brando's eyes, these people's style of doing things was similar to that of the Brotherhood of Thieves. In short, with the help of these people, the box was successfully smuggled out without any hiccups. The people who transported the box had done this kind of work over the years, and the box was moved like a stone in their hands. They did not even look at it from beginning to end. Brando could not help but feel lucky that he was quick-witted enough to cast a windwing spell on the box. Otherwise, with the experience of these people, he was afraid that they would find out that there was a problem with the weight. By the time they transported everything back to the manor and went to Hood to retrieve the last relic of Amandina's father, or rather, the relic of Sword St. Darius, it was almost evening. Brando opened the box in his study and took out the things in the box one by one, and then the scene appeared. But compared to Freya's confusion, Brando and Amandina's expressions were a little different. "My lord, these stone pieces." Amandina remembered sharply. "I seem to have seen them when I was young. When my father first bought them from a merchant, it was as if he had obtained a treasure. After that, he has been buying these stone pieces everywhere. I remember that for quite a long time, he has been playing with these stone pieces." "Did he tell you anything?" Brando stared at the gray crystal and asked without turning his head. Amandina recalled for a moment but shook her head. "I was too young at that time. I vaguely remember my father saying a few times that these stone pieces seemed to be the key to something. But later these stone pieces gradually disappeared from my sight. I thought my father had lost interest in them, but I didn't expect him to keep them." "Amandina, have you ever thought that these things are actually related to my grandfather?" Brando replied. "I'm afraid so. According to the letter, this box contains the relics of Lord Darius, as well as the fragments of the picture that father spoke of." "Are you referring to these pieces of stone?" Amandina asked with a hint of doubt, but Brando did not answer. He stared fixedly at the gray gemstone. "Oh." Chapter 893. Under the light, the gray gemstone appeared dim yet dazzling. This contradictory feeling blended so naturally on this gemstone, as if it would attract people's attention at a glance. Anyone who saw this gemstone for the first time would know that it was not an ordinary gemstone. But this gray gemstone was so familiar to Brando that he opened the dimensional space and took out another gray gemstone that was almost identical to this one. When he slowly opened his palm, Freya let out a soft exclamation. "Brando, the gemstone in your hand is exactly the same as the one your grandfather left behind. Did Lord Darius leave this to you?" Brando glanced at the Erewhon Valkyrie, which gave the latter a shock. Freya had never seen him show such a strange expression and subconsciously thought that she had said something wrong. Brando took a light breath and put the gemstone back. In fact, he still had one more gemstone like this. He had seen similar things twice before. The first time was in the Loop of Trade Winds. The second time was under the glacier in the Deadly Frost Forest. In the Loop of Trade Winds, Archbishop Amon and Wind Empress Saint Tossel called this gemstone the Sealing Stone. And under the glacier in the Strange Dream, the Myrna people worshipped it as a sacred object. But he knew in his heart what this thing was, the soul fragment of the Darkness Dragon. This gray gemstone emitted a strange light because it was transparent inside, which meant that the inheritance in the gemstone had been extracted. And this gemstone, it was a relic left behind by his grandfather. Sword Saint Darius was the Darkness Dragon? Brando was shocked by this sudden thought. This seemed to explain why Darius was judged by the Holy Cathedral of Fire, exiled, and chose to leave the center of power of the kingdom and live in seclusion. Why did the Allies suddenly change sides during the Holy War? It was because Sword Saint Darius was the Darkness Dragon. Because of this truth, everything seemed to make sense. He shook his head again. But this did not explain why they were attacked by Madara's undead army from behind during the Third Holy War in the game. Besides, if his grandfather was the Darkness Dragon, the Holy Cathedral of Fire wouldn't let him off so easily. After all, the Darkness Dragon was the archenemy of the 4 holy cathedrals. Another suspicious point came from his grandfather's lifespan. In Brando's memories, his grandfather had passed away due to illness, but in fact it was also due to the gradual aging and decline of his body's functions. His final lifespan could only be considered to be slightly longer among ordinary people, but with Sword Saint Darius's strength and realm, he had passed away at an untimely age. He had long suspected this. Not to mention, after receiving the Dark Dragon's inheritance, his lifespan would be greatly increased. He knew very well what the inheritance of the Dark Dragon meant. It was the blood of God. Brando bent his knuckles and gently knocked on the desk. Doubts arose in his heart, as if there was a faint thread in his thoughts, but he couldn't grasp the thread at the moment. At this time Freya suddenly said, "Brando Amina, take a look at this map." Brando already had some guesses and conclusions in his heart at this moment. He raised his head and looked at the simple map, but when he looked at it he was slightly startled. Because on the papyrus map, there were only a few simple lines outlined with a pen that was difficult to fade, and then some crooked annotations were written. The whole map was almost impossible to understand, but he suddenly felt as if he had seen this map somewhere before. Was it in the game? He immediately shook his head. There were very few secret maps in the game. Sophie had come across a few, but most of them were clearer than this one. And in this life he had come across even fewer secret maps. About this map, although he had an impression in his mind, he couldn't remember where he had seen it. Freya looked at him and Amandina, then said, "These annotations are also secret text, and it seems to say a place called Osopal." Osopal? Amandina was stunned. Erwin doesn't have such a place. Cruz doesn't have it either. Brando replied. He took a deep breath. This is the name of the Myrna people. The Myrna people once had a great battle with the Cruz people and the Wind Elves there. All of a sudden he remembered. That feeling was as if another image subconsciously appeared in his mind, and this image naturally overlapped with this simple map, making him suddenly tremble. He suddenly remembered that he had seen this map here before. The Myrna people, Tumen. Tumen had once hidden a map in his mind when he officially embarked on the path of a planeswalker. That map would occasionally appear in his mind, but when he actively tried to recall it, he couldn't remember a single thing. It was because of this that he had a feeling of familiarity and strangeness. This moment he completely understood. The map that Tumen gave him only had lines of undulating mountains and rivers, but Amandina's father had marked on it. The place that Freya pointed to was the Osopal Plains, which was today's four-leaf clover field. However, there were also some places that Brando thought should be the names of the Myrna people that corresponded to today's names. But the map left behind by Amandina's father was still blank. Although Brando didn't know why Borg Nessun would draw such a map, he faintly guessed that the latter was looking for something, and this thing was not only related to the war between the Myrna people and the Black Dwarves 1,000 years ago. It was also related to his grandfather. Grandfather, who in the world are you? Brando couldn't help but groan in his heart. He looked at the 3 items on the table, and the doubts in his heart suddenly became more profound than when he didn't find any clues. It was as if he had parted the fog and found that there were even more black clouds behind it, and he couldn't even see his own fingers if he stretched out his hand. His heart was filled with doubts, and he finally couldn't help but open the telepathic link, and said to the Shire and Medisha on the other side, "The Shire, Medisha, are you there? I have a question to ask you." But he didn't expect that as soon as he opened his mouth, the Shire's surprised voice sounded. "Ha, my lord, I have something to ask you, and I didn't expect to hear your voice. Our hearts are really connected." "Cut the crap," Brando interrupted him in a huff. "The Shire, let me ask you, do you know the 2 people, Fearmead and Shipperd?" The voice on the other side became excited. "My lord, why are you asking about them? That means you know them? Of course, they are your grandfather's attendants. Fearmead was born in the Anna family, and is the 2nd son of the Count of Grey Mountain. Shipperd was born in a small noble family in Cipher, and he was a famous genius back in the day." The Shire paused and continued. "Brando, did you find them?" Brando shook his head. "I only heard about it by chance." "Did your father tell you?" The Shire sighed. "I have been looking for them. So you don't know about their situation?" "My lord, when they received the princess's order, they left without saying goodbye. I know they must have known something, so I have been looking for them." The Shire replied. Brando frowned and asked sharply, "Her Highness?" The Shire's voice became hoarse and then he said, "Ah, you misheard, my lord. The Shire. I heard from the Nightsong Tiger that the scenery in the Gemplains is very good. I think it is time to give you a holiday." Brando silently threatened. The Shire's voice was almost crying. All right, Brando, please don't put me in confinement, listen to me. All right, that princess. You know, your father almost became the betrothed of one of Princess Griffine's aunts." "One of them? I can't reveal her name. I have to protect a lady's reputation. Besides, she may not meet you." The Shire said helplessly. "Is what you said true?" "It's absolutely true," the young attendant mage promised solemnly. Brando frowned. He felt that this guy's words were not completely trustworthy, but if it was true, then the clues were cut off again. He shook his head and suddenly he remembered something. "What do you want from me?" Don't you have something to ask Medisha?" The Shire's forehead was full of cold sweat, and he wanted to change the topic, but he heard Brando's cold snort, and he quickly replied, "All right, if you don't have something urgent on your side, you should listen to a piece of news from me." "What news?" Brando was surprised. It was a magic message from a certain countess's subordinate, and she passed it to me. Dilfrey? In front of the princess was a silver brooch. She picked it up and looked at it carefully, then silently put it down. She still remembered the situation that afternoon. The afternoon sun seemed to have a certain taste, and the leaves rustled, but there was no sound except for the silence. She gently tiptoed, then slowly retracted her cold lips. Brando's eyes widened, and he looked at the princess with some confusion. Brando, I'm really grateful to hear that you still want to go down this path, but I still hope that you can seriously consider our engagement. Why? Brando frowned and asked. Erewhon is a small country, and to fight against potential enemies, we must gather the power of the whole kingdom, and even restore the ancient system, Griffine said. Griffine took a few steps back and looked at him carefully with her light silver-gray, bright eyes. But this ancient kingdom has been ruled by Cypher and my family for 2 generations. I know it too well. The nobles under my father's rule have different intentions, short-sighted, and only a few have ideals. These people are not worthy of trust. As if to emphasize this sentence, she gently shook her head. The kingdom must re-centralize power, re-establish the local tax system that has been suspended since Anson's time, and weaken the military power of the nobles. But Brando suddenly understood the hidden meaning behind the but. The Southern Territory already had the foundation to restore the royal power, but the right to decide the future of the whole Southern Territory fell on him. If he supported the princess without reservation, then whether Duke Anthony, Duke Vero, or Duke Grinoires objected or not, the final result would not change. The Battle of Autumn Twilight had already shown that Tanajul had such a decisive military power. But if he objected, or even just maintained the status quo, then the local nobles would follow his lead and be indifferent. Indeed, the Duke of Vero was the princess's grandfather, and the Duke of Anthony was, at least in name, an ally of the princess. The Highland Knights were detached, but the local nobility and the central royal family were naturally antagonistic. The Duke of Vero would never risk losing his power to support his granddaughter, and the Duke of Anthony was the same. They were happy to see a royal family close to them, but would not allow it to override them. This was a natural conflict between the princess's ideals and the duke's core interests. But what should he do? The kingdom must re-centralize power, and Tanajul and Valhalla naturally could not be detached. It could even be said that they were the first to bear the brunt of this. Her Highness wants me to set an example, but can I trust this half-elf girl? Trondheim and Valhalla were built by me step by step. It's where many people's hopes and future lie. The Red Bronze Dragon mercenaries who experienced the November War, the adventurers who were persecuted by Grodin, the residents of the Green Village, and even Amandina and Carglass. Their hopes and dreams are all wrapped around me. This is the responsibility that comes with authority. Can I pass this responsibility to others? He silently weighed everything in his heart. From an emotional point of view, he was willing to trust the princess. She was able to persist in her ideals, and had a heart that pursued benevolence and justice. She was the eldest princess of Erewhon, and the holy princess who had won the hearts of countless players in history. But no one was perfect. Whether she would still be controlled by her aristocratic nature in this life, hesitating and compromising with the conservative forces, was related to the fate of many people. Reason told Brando that the princess had a weak side in her nature, and she was not a true reformer. And all of this depended on the gentleness in her nature. History had already judged everything, and today's outcome depended on his choice. Brando was very clear that he was different from the princess. He had no foundation in this world, and the only thing he cared about was his parents. But Princess Griffine had an unbreakable connection with the old nobles, and she was not the ruthless Silver Queen. Brando looked at the princess in front of him. She was half a head shorter than him, and she raised her head slightly. Her pale silver-gray eyes did not avoid his gaze. She pursed her lips and her silver curly hair fell down, shining beautifully under the sunlight. Her pointy ears peeked out from under her long hair, showing that she was an elf. No one would doubt the beauty of this princess. She had the nobility of a royal family mixed with the natural intimacy of a forest breeze. Of course, Brando would not forget that his lips still had the fragrance of a young girl. "I know what you are thinking, Brando." Princess Griffine saw that he understood and said. But if the person who can decide the future of a kingdom is too naive, it may not be a good sign for you and for me. Brando heard the hidden meaning in her words, so he asked, "Then what do you think I should do, Your Highness?" Princess Griffine looked at Brando. He could actually take the same path as Erek, dethroning her and Haruz, and establish himself as king. His strength was actually better, and he had more ability and time to do so. However, if he did so, he would lose the reputation that accompanied him in his rightful position. If all he needed was a throne and supreme power, he could have chosen this path. But if he chose the latter path, he would lose far more than he would gain. Princess Griffine's eyes lit up slightly. She looked at the different noble, the count, and quietly replied, "Marry me. I am Haruz's sister. In fact, it's not that I don't have the right to inherit the throne, and you, as my husband, can legitimately manage and rule this country according to the traditions of the kingdom. At that time, Tanajul and Valhalla will be the territory of the royal family. Viro, Lantinilan, and even Grinwars and Karsuk will submit to you, which is also a legitimate matter." She paused. "However, if one day you no longer have any interest in the throne, only Haruz or his descendants can inherit this position." Wasn't this Erek? But the conditions were much harsher. Brando listened to Princess Griffine's words and couldn't help but smile bitterly. "Your Highness, but it doesn't sound like I'm marrying you. It sounds like I'm marrying you." Princess Griffine smiled somewhat mockingly. She could see that Brando didn't care about the power in his hands. "But I already have a fiancé," Brando could only reply. "Let's put this matter aside first." "It's okay. Then I'll wait for your answer." Princess Griffine was not annoyed at all, but smiled slightly. Brendel had no choice but to flee. Griffine's fingers pressed on the brooch, as if she had recovered from her memories. She looked up at the sunset outside the window. The sunset was as red as fire, hanging far below the golden clouds. At this time there was a knock on the door. She was slightly startled, listened to the sound, and said, "Please come in, Mrs. Hill." After the door opened, it was her maid who appeared outside. The woman in her 40s held a letter in her hand and stood outside the door respectfully. "Your Highness. It's so late, what's the matter?" Princess Griffine looked at her and asked. "There's a letter from Valendenburg," Mrs. Hill replied. "Is it for me?" "Yes, it's a letter from Mr. Oberway." Griffine took the letter, opened the envelope, then unfolded the letter inside and read it carefully. She raised her eyebrows slightly at first, then her face changed color. "Your Highness, the Silver Empress of the Cruz Empire has recently made an exception to confer the title of Countess to a female. According to reliable information, this new Countess is from Erewhon and has some kind of close relationship with Count Tanajul." Chapter 894. Cruz's Envoy? A man named Donis Burney, a Viscount. "Wait, I know this man," Brando interrupted the Shire, remembering that Veronica had once told him this name. This man was a secret envoy of the Silver Queen. After the explosion in the Deadly Frost Forest, the Empire sent an envoy to investigate the whereabouts of the eldest prince. This man was the main person in charge of the envoy. Veronica also told him that this man's real purpose was probably to confirm the death of the eldest prince. "I also know about this envoy." He finally remembered this matter. Recently, there had been a succession of affairs, mainly the Autumn Twilight War and the sudden letter from Her Royal Highness, which made him almost forget about this matter. Are these Cruz people ready to return to the Empire? Why did Dilfrey suddenly tell us this? "No, my lord, in fact, the Cruz envoy is still in Lantinilan. Now they are in charge of someone else. According to our understanding, this Mr. Donis Burney has not appeared from beginning to end," the Shire replied. "What the hell is going on?" Brando frowned. It is said that because the Viscount suddenly felt unwell, he returned with the fleet in Durtal. He did not go ashore in Erek at all. Brando thought that this was obviously an excuse. Since this man was the Queen's secret envoy, how could he return empty-handed because he was unwell? He first thought that maybe the Cruz people noticed something, but then he suddenly realized how Dilfrey knew about this. In the territory, there were only a few people around him who knew about the existence of the Broken Sword Knight Order and Prince Leneret. He suppressed the doubts in his heart and asked, "This is just an internal matter of the Cruz people. Why did Miss Dilfrey tell us this?" The Shire naturally understood Brando's subtext. He replied, My lord, this is actually the case. It is said that the cruise people's returning fleet hunted a rare beast on the shining sea, and wanted to present it to Her Majesty the Queen. In order to guard against the attack of the Temple of the Earth, they chose a more reliable land route. Count Yanbao's situation is unknown. Some people say that he is seriously ill, some say that he is dead. In short, he has not appeared in public since 4 or 5 months. As for Miss Dilfrey, well, Miss Dilfrey is now Tanajul's guest. When he said the word guest, there was inevitably some awkwardness. In fact, everyone knew that the Countess was worried about her father's situation, and was eager to fly back to the Yanbao territory immediately. However, she was placed under house arrest in Abies by Brando. Of course, this was also at the behest of Her Royal Highness the Princess. The purpose was to ensure the safety of the Countess, so that she would not be a moth to a flame. He paused for a moment and continued. All in all, now Yanbao is a dragon without a head. Those guys led by Baron Dahl spread all kinds of rumors all day long, wanting to seize the Count's power. However, the Yanbao family's reputation is still there, and it will be difficult for them to succeed in a short time. The cruise empire has also had considerable influence in Yanbao for a long time, so of course, these people will not let go of the opportunity to curry favor with Viscount Donna's Burney. I don't know if you still remember that you and Her Royal Highness had asked Count Yanalasu to investigate Yanbao. Soon after that, the Count sent a group of people into Yanbao. These people were quite efficient. They quickly got in touch with Dilfrey's old subordinates and established a secret network. Brando knew that this matter was actually ordered by Her Royal Highness, and he did not intervene at all. However, when it came to the Shire's mouth, he, the feudal lord, got half of the credit for no reason. Of course he could hear this kind of compliment, but it was difficult to expose it. Or rather, it was better to say that he had long been used to it. But when he heard this, he finally understood something. The Shire continued. So these people reported this matter to Count Yanalasu as usual. They also used a record crystal to attach the images of the convoy, Mr. Donna's Burney, and other accompanying servants and assistants. Count Yanalasu then sent the report and the record crystal to Miss Dilfrey. This matter itself is not too important, but Miss Dilfrey more or less heard about you, Lady Veronica, and Prince Lenoret entering the deadly frost forest together. After she learned about the purpose of this diplomatic mission, she was worried that the Kurlutzians would harm you, my lord, so she handed these things over to Med-Isa. I didn't expect that our little princess would really find out something fish. What's fishy? Brando frowned slightly when he heard this. This Viscount Donna's Burney, there's nothing wrong with him, but Princess Medisha seems to have recognized someone among the entourage and assistants of the convoy. Recognized someone? Brando's heart skipped a beat. Who? This person should be one of the military officers accompanying Cruz and Veronica. I have some impression of him, but it's not as deep as Medisha's. My lord, Medisha's voice finally sounded at this time. It was as gentle as ever, but it was organized. If I remember correctly, that person should be called Boymare. I've heard others call him that before. He went under the glacier with us at that time. He's one of the noble military officers accompanying Cruz. He's a little young, about 20 years old. Brando felt as if there was an electric current flowing through his back, making his hair stand on end. He took a light breath. Although he did not speak, his expression was so serious that Amandina and Freya could see the clues. The two girls looked at each other and looked at him with some worry. Brando put his hands on the desk. Countless images flashed through his mind. He thought carefully for a moment and suddenly asked, when did Cruz's envoy arrive in Durtal? The 19th of August. That's the fire-raising festival of the mountain people. Amandina answered without thinking. The 19th of August. Brando repeated to himself. It's been 4 weeks since we left the deadly tundra. It's been exactly a month. The Shire. How long has it been since Viscount Donna's Burney arrived in Yanbao? He asked again. The Shire calculated. Miss Dilfrey received the letter last week, but it took a lot of twists and turns to reach Tanajul. It should have been at least a month before that, not less. A month. Brando's heart went cold. This was enough time for Cruz to walk back to Lust Tower. Freya looked at him from the side and finally couldn't help but ask. Brando, what happened? I think we were careless, Freya. Brando answered word by word. Careless? It's all my fault. I didn't think of this direction at all. He could not help but pat his forehead in annoyance. Then he said in a deep voice, Seal, let the spies we sent out ask. Let them search the area around the deadly frost forest again. Spread out the image of that guy and confirm if anyone has seen him. No, I think someone has definitely seen him. The key is where and when. I want to find out the answer to this question as soon as possible. Also, think of a way to send a group of people to the Cruz Empire. If it doesn't work, ask Count Janalesu to help us. He won't refuse. My lord, before I pass this message to you, Miss Roman had already sent people. Now the territory is fully activated, the Shire replied. But there are some mercenary leaders who still don't understand the situation. They want to ask if you are making a fuss over nothing. Medisha and I are also here to ask you for instructions. She did the right thing. Brando heard the news and let out a long sigh. Wait for the news. I hope Cruz won't regret it. Brando felt someone pressing down on his arm. He turned around and saw Amandina looking at him with some worry. Is there news about Scarlet? Amandina asked sharply. He nodded slowly. The victory of the Battle of Autumn Dusk had not yet spread throughout the south, but all kinds of rumors had already spread widely in the areas affected by the war. The Ranner people were uneasy for the first 2 weeks, but they were also looking forward to it. They were uneasy because they were afraid of being punished, but they were also looking forward to it because the young and promising Count was likely to become their new ruler in the future. But compared to the other parts of the south where all kinds of rumors were flying, Viro and Tanajil were uncharacteristically quiet. In Viro, Fort Valentine was sending out a large number of messengers day after day. They carried the secret letter back and forth between the north and south, day after day. In Tanajil, only a few people with sharp senses could sense that a storm was brewing under the calm surface. The merchants in Port Gris gradually began to feel that the patrols of the cavalry were becoming more frequent, and the inspections were becoming stricter day after day. The goods exported from the territory were also quietly changing. The magic crystals in the Black Forest had been decreasing for several months, and it seemed that they had finally run out. Furs, leather, and metal ores were replaced by other goods, and the number of ships transporting goods into the territory had suddenly increased. Some people were secretly speculating that the people of Tanajil were preparing for a new war. The weather was getting colder by the day, but the black pines in the forest seemed to be growing taller in the cold weather. Or perhaps it was the withered leaves that set off these evergreen Arrowan symbols. Even though the rivers had not started to freeze, most of them were already covered in white frost. At the beginning of November, it was said that people in Menta saw knights descending from the sky and walking out of the flames. These knights were like gods descending from the heavens, patrolling the skies for a while before disappearing. Those who witnessed this scene with their own eyes swore that they were the maids of war. It was said that when they appeared, it often meant the arrival of an era of war. While these illusory legends were spreading, a message tied to the leg of a carrier pigeon fell into the hands of the Shire. There's news, my lord. When the Shire spoke through the telepathic link, Brando was still telling his mother the stories that had happened in the past few days. The fireplace was already lit, and the charcoal crackled inside the iron fence. He had already repeated his experiences more than 10 times, but Lady Windsor did not get tired of it at all, especially when she knew that her son had a kind-hearted and good housekeeper in Tanajil. This was how Brando described it. He thought that the Roman's mind was simple, and could probably be described as kind-hearted. As for housekeeping, the merchant girl had the ability to gain something without risking anything, so it should be barely acceptable. But when he heard the Shire's words, he immediately stood up from the sofa and gestured to his mother, Amandina, and Freya. He then walked to the side and asked in a low voice, "What's going on?" "My lord, you guessed right. Someone has seen this person near the deadly frost forest. That person is a farmer near Bernisel called Old Bayard. He has a daughter called Jocelyn, and they rented a carriage to that person after the explosion. It is said that the person gave them a sum of money and never appeared again. There was another person with him, and according to the girl's description, Medisha believes that the second person should be a noble called Babarn. They rented a carriage." Brando muttered to himself, Bernisel has a hostel, so why would they rent a carriage from a farmer's house? Most of the farmers' carriages are covered wagons with large sheds. Normal nobles would not ride those things. They wanted to store something, the Shire replied. And then? Brando asked again. Did anyone see this carriage near Dirtle? No, if I were them I would be more careful. They should have changed carriages along the way. My lord, you guessed correctly. They changed carriages at Arucher and Winterrose Castle. But after we confirmed their route, it was easy to ask for these details. The last carriage they used was indeed last seen in Dirtle. Someone saw them around the middle of August. Middle of August, Brando replied. Dirtle cruise. He took a deep breath and clenched his fists so tightly that his knuckles cracked. He practically squeezed out the last few words from between his teeth. Mr. Donna's Bernie and the others, the rare beast they were escorting, was probably transported by a carriage, right? Yes, my lord. The Shire was silent for a while before he replied. My lord. Amandina and Freya sat on the sofa and looked at Brando's gloomy face. The fireplace in the study room was also burning with flames, illuminating a few faces. Go and invite the Count, Mistress Hill. I'll have to trouble you. Princess Grafine put down the letter in her hand and looked at Makarov. This was the 10th letter she received in 2 weeks. This letter was personally sent by the cunning fox of the kingdom. It was obvious that the royal faction had foreseen the subtle changes in the situation. It was not strange for the Empire to confer the title of Countess. It could even be said that it had nothing to do with Erwin. But the Countess' birth was related to a similarly sensitive person in the kingdom. After reading the letter, Grafine let go of the last bit of hope in her heart and gently threw the letter on the table. She was exhausted as she spoke to her maidservant. The noblewoman opened the door and walked out. She could not help but look back at the withered leaves outside the window and sighed slightly. Your Highness, Makarov reminded her softly. You don't have to say anything, Lord Makarov. I understand. Grafine looked at him and replied. In just a moment Brando came into her study room. His expression was still a little stiff, as if he had not recovered from the news he received earlier. He bowed to Princess Grafine and raised his head. Naturally, he saw Princess Grafine sitting behind the desk and Makarov standing beside her. Brando looked at the cunning fox of the kingdom, and then turned his gaze to Grafine. Neither of them spoke, but they seemed to understand each other's thoughts. The princess lowered her head and looked at the letter on the table. She said softly, Mr. Brando, I have to tell you about this. It's about the azure lance, isn't it? Brando opened his mouth. Grafine looked up at him. Her pale silver-gray eyes were full of complicated emotions, but she finally told him about Scarlet in detail. The Silver Queen had already made her a countess of the Empire. In the past 2 weeks, all the news from various sources had been confirmed, including the origin of this mountain girl and her relationship with the Count of Tonagel. After she finished, she asked softly, Brando, what do you plan to do? Your Highness, guess what I would do if this question was asked by someone from Cruz. Brando was silent for a moment. Then he replied with a somewhat cold tone. Grafine's hand that was flat on her skirt tightened. Of course, she could hear the hidden anger in Brando's calm voice. But she looked straight into his eyes, her eyes flashing with the light of thinking, but she did not answer. Instead, it was Makarov who spoke. My lord, they are from Cruz. I know. My lord, Her Highness is telling you this out of respect. But I have to ask you a question. Have you thought about the relationship between Tonagel and the kingdom, and between Tonagel and the Empire? So, Brando asked. Don't put the kingdom in danger because of a moment of anger. The azure lance is important to the kingdom, but it's not important enough to let innocent people bleed and die for it. Makarov sighed and advised patiently. Brando looked at this person, an important member of the royal faction. He shook his head as if he heard a joke and replied, Mr. Makarov, you are mistaken about one thing. I don't care about the azure lance at all. The only mistake the Empire made today was to not go against the will of a person and take her away from this land. Of course, you may not care who this person is, but I have to tell you one thing. His voice wasn't loud, but it seemed to be filled with an invisible magic that silenced the room. Grafine and Lady Hill beside her had never seen a noble who could speak so boldly to his peers. Grafine's eyes flashed slightly, while the lady was almost stunned. Makarov's expression was very ugly. He suddenly realized that this wasn't the first time Brando reprimanded him like this. Brando didn't care about his thoughts and replied softly, "If the Empire thinks that by forcing a war, the nobles of the Erewhon Kingdom will consider the bigger picture and retreat, then I have only one thing to say to them. I, Brando, Lord of Abes, Count of the Tonajal Kingdom, have not developed the habit of condoning such logic." He said to Makarov, "I promise that the people of the Erewhon Kingdom will not shed blood for meaningless reasons, but the kingdom protects its people. This is the most glorious thing in the world. If the people of the Erewhon Kingdom can shed blood for another person of the Erewhon Kingdom today, then more people will shed blood for them tomorrow. Mr. Makarov, this is the pride and backbone of a people. If anyone thinks that they are weak and can be bullied, then they are gravely mistaken." Brando finished and bowed to Grifine like a knight bidding farewell to his king. He turned around and opened the door. Before he left, he said, "Your Highness, I once promised a little girl that I will protect each and every one of them. I will keep my promise, whether the enemy is Cruz or Madara, or even the whole world. I will not go back on my words. Your Highness, if this is what the people of the Cruz Kingdom want, then I will answer them with these two words: war." Kacha *. The door closed in front of the three people in the room. Makarov's expression changed. He wanted to say something, but he didn't know what to say. In the end, he could only sigh helplessly and bid farewell to the princess. The two of them left the study one after the other. After a long while, Mrs. Hill seemed to have recovered from the previous shock. She couldn't help but pat her chest and said with some trepidation, "This is outrageous. This count is really bold. He really dares to go to war with the Kurlutz people?" Grifine turned around and looked at her maid in a daze. "Did you know, Lady Hill?" she said in a daze. "My father's nobles also faced the same question. Do you know what they said to me?" She took a deep breath, and her eyes seemed to have returned to that stormy night in Ampere Seal. P.S. It took a bit of time to think about the new plot, so it was a bit late. To make it up to everyone, I added 6,000 words. Chapter 895. Under the towering curved dome, the undulating sacred sound finally came to an end. 12 high-ranking priests wearing gold-trimmed red robes were deathly pale, almost unable to stand steadily. The attendants and low-ranking servants at the side hurriedly stepped forward to support them. These high-ranking figures were either the regional archbishop of Rusta or the senior scholars of the academy. Their statuses were grand and respected, and could be said to be second only to the figures above the dome of the Holy Cathedral of Fire. Their strength matched their statuses. Among them, Archbishop Christopher of the Coan region, Blessed Andres, and Master Sutton of the Academy had already entered the path of truth and were only a step away from the sanctum of fire. The residents of Rusta were used to calling the 11 people above the dome of the Holy Cathedral of Fire the sanctum of fire. Over time this saying had spread. In addition to these 3 people, the other 9 people had also activated their elemental energy. Normally, people of their status would rarely personally preside over the sacraments or ceremonies. But when they did, most of them were at their fingertips and would never be in such a sorry state as they were now. It's really breathtaking. The person who looked at this scene was Vala. It was hard to imagine that the person in charge of the entire Holy Cathedral of Fire was such a kind-looking little old man. His beard and eyebrows were already snow-white, and his body had shrunk a lot. He wore a red bishop's cape with snow-white fur edges. His hands were clasped behind his back, and he trembled as if a gust of wind could blow him away. But only a pair of deep drooping eyelids, with a flash of light in his eyes and the clear lines of his tightly pursed lips, could prove that this old man who had controlled the Holy Cathedral for more than half a century was not as simple as he appeared to be. The world called him the Great Priest of Fire and Iron. He was the only one of the 11 Sanctum of Fire who had experienced a complete holy war. There was a popular saying about him in Rusta: "The Sanctum of Fire is never merciful." This saying described his character, and he was definitely not as kind as he looked. He stood on the altar with 2 others, and the person he was speaking to was a woman on the left behind him. She was tall, wearing a short white shawl, a tall crown on her head, and a scepter with a golden flame emblem in her hand. Her long shawl dragged on the smooth obsidian floor. Her face was a little too thin, and her cheeks seemed to have been cut by a knife or an axe, so much so that her feminine beauty could not be seen, and she appeared too cold. She had short platinum hair, tied in a long thin braid at the back of her head, hanging over her shawl. This woman was Sydney Metferica, the third in command of the Holy Cathedral of Fire, and the fourth master of the Kurlutz Empire. The legends about her were innumerable since the Year of the Stars. It was said that she had fought with the fourth leader of the Bugha's wizards and lost by a hair, but it was a glorious defeat. Ordinary people often described a person's gaze as sharp as an eagle's, but such words seemed weak in front of this lady. Her gaze was not only sharp, but it also seemed to have substance. With just a glance, people could understand what she meant. There was a circle of golden flame in the depths of her pupils, which was related to the divine power she wielded, the angel of the holy sword Aroma. In terms of mastery of the holy words, no one in the empire could surpass her. Even Vala had to admit this. The other person next to Vala was extremely ornate in his silk robe. He had a kind face and looked more like a businessman. This person was called Caesar, and he was ranked at the bottom of the 11. His name sounded very domineering, but he was diligent in history but did not achieve much. Sydney maintained her usual silence. Even when the master of the Holy Cathedral of Fire spoke in front of her, she had no intention of responding. It was not unreasonable for people to call her the adoratress of the Leo Palace, but Vala admired her character. Compared to the era of the previous generation of the Great Priest, because of the Holy War, this generation of the Holy Cathedral of Fire was generally younger. Young people always seemed to be too radical but not calm enough except for Sydney. His Majesty issued an edict on the 14th, and these people entered the city on the 17th. The people of the scholastics were the most responsive, Great Priest, Caesar reminded in a low voice. Vala nodded. He certainly understood the hidden meaning of this sentence. For centuries, Cruz's imperial power had finally developed to its peak in the past 100 years. Sometimes he could not help but think how good it would be if he was born in the era before his teacher. At that time, the Holy Cathedral could not only develop its power freely in small countries like Erewhon and Antiburo, but also intervene in secular affairs. In the era when the religious power was at its peak, even the right of succession to the throne was in the hands of the Great Priest. But now? The old man could only feel bitterness in his mouth. After this, I'm afraid that His Majesty's influence within the Holy Cathedral will rise again, Great Priest. I understand. Vala shook his head. The scholastics had always been closer to the royal family. They had been wanting to carry out doctrinal reforms since the Year of Thunder, and had long begun to criticize the Great Priest. Although a group of people had been purged after the Holy War, this obviously could not stop those lunatics. The Holy Cathedral was indeed going to undergo changes, and he was more and more aware of this point. But the authority to preside over the changes must not fall into the hands of those who formed cliques for personal gain. Otherwise, there would be no tomorrow for the Holy Cathedral of Fire. He knew that Caesar's words were reminding him that he should not satisfy Her Majesty's request this time. Although the imperial power was increasingly infiltrating the Holy Cathedral, the Holy Cathedral of Fire still had the right to decide its own internal affairs. His decision allowed the Supreme, who seemed to never age, to reach into the interior of the Holy Cathedral, which had long caused dissatisfaction among many of the 11 people. Today, only he, Sydney, and Caesar were present, which showed that Sydney was not interested in fighting for power, Caesar was submissive, and the others were obviously very dissatisfied. But that's the Azure Lance. Vala let out a long sigh. Their empress was too difficult to deal with. Sometimes he wondered whether it was Cruz's fortune to have such an empress, or the misfortune of the Holy Cathedral of Fire. The Azure Lance was a sacred object of the mortal world, an object brought to the Second Era by the Azure Knight who shattered the sky. In the Pale poem it was described as the hope of mortals, the holy lance that changed fate. It could be imagined that if any holy cathedral had such an artifact and gained its recognition, it would greatly increase the prestige of the Holy Cathedral. Whether it was for public or private reasons he could not refuse. Caesar also closed his mouth. Of course he understood the meaning of this. He could not help but look back at his colleagues. Even Sydney, who usually had the same expression on his face, had a glint in his eyes at this moment. After all, it was the Holy Lance of Heaven. What a pity, why did the person who held the lance have to be a mountain person? Caesar thought regretfully. If he did not already know that the Holy Lance was transported out of Erewhon and had an owner before that, he would have thought that this was the plan of the Supreme Empress. Because as everyone knew, among the countries under the rule of the Holy Cathedral of Fire, only the mountain people did not believe in the teachings of Gretel. They worshipped their ancestors and the spirit of nature, so they were called the barbarians. But it was such barbarians who were recognized by the Holy Lance. Your Majesty, giving the object that changes fate to a foreign race, just to suppress the Holy Cathedral, you are playing with fire. How can mortals control the future in their hands? The gods are bound to sin. Vala was also helpless, and could not help but mutter to himself. The three of them did not speak, and silently watched the crystal in the center of the hall thin layer by layer, and finally disappear into nothingness. The girl inside closed her eyes, and with the lance in her hand, broke out of the ice, as if she had lost her center of gravity. She weakly knelt on the ground, then fell down and just like that, fainted on the floor that was filled with layers of formations. Vala looked at the pieces of crystal that fell to the ground, and vaguely saw the Holy Cathedral falling apart. The scholastic faction was no longer on their side, and the local officiants were also indecisive. William's failure was a heavy blow to the Holy Cathedral's prestige outside the empire. He thought of that good-for-nothing guy, and could not help but feel angry. A dignified knight commander of the Holy Cathedral was defeated by a junior. It was simply humiliating. Unfortunately, it was not only his face that was lost, or the Cecil family's face, but also the Holy Cathedral's face at the same time. He then thought of Erewhon, the little Count of Tonnagel, the rumored grandson of the sword Saint Darius, and could not help but mutter, "Why is it this guy again? He's really haunting me." Caesar heard this whisper from the side and could not help but shiver, and his face changed. Of course, he still remembered the upheaval 40 years ago, the decline of the Holy Cathedral, as if it was the beginning of that unfair trial. He looked at the high priest beside him, and suddenly thought that the high priest agreed to Her Majesty's conditions so readily. It was probably not just because of the azure lance. He suddenly remembered that as early as last week at the royal banquet, Her Majesty seemed to have vaguely revealed the origin of the new countess, and her relationship with Erewhon, the Count of Tonnagel. Thinking of this, he could not help but break out in a cold sweat, and hurriedly tightened his face, as if he was afraid that the Supreme One beside him would see his thoughts. But Vala did not care about him at all, and instead turned to Sydney and said, "Sydney, take the Countess to bathe and freshen up and be good to her." The high priest was stunned, and then nodded indifferently. The girl was dressed like a princess. She was wrapped in a Baroque light yellow dress. Her fiery red hair was draped over her shoulders like flowing flames. Her slender neck and delicate collarbone were exposed in the air. A thin mithril necklace was threaded through a flaming diamond. The amber color of the necklace reflected the healthy luster of her skin. The fluffy skirt was full of rose-like folds, the multiple layers of sleeves, the gauze lining, and the huge bow on the chest almost dressed her up like a delicate doll. And the tight girdle that hugged her waist almost broke her waist, making her breathless. Scarlet looked at all this, somewhat at a loss, her amber eyes full of uneasiness. The experience of this day was like an absurd dream to her. She dreamed that she was sleeping in a huge piece of amber, during which she experienced many things and saw strange scenery, but most of the time she was covered with a black cloth, or locked in a box, never to see the light of day. Occasionally, when she felt uneasy, there would be a voice to chat with her, but the frequency was not particularly high. The young lady of the azure lance was so proud that she could not wait to draw a conclusion in 2 sentences to prove that she was a fool. Then she saw herself being transported into a magnificent temple, where many priests were performing a ritual around her, and her ears were filled with the low humming of hymns. Then she felt as if she had woken up, and in a hazy state, there was a lady in a white robe leading her. And then the lady asked a few maids to help her bathe and change her clothes. Scarlet had never experienced such a scene in her life, and she was almost scared stiff. She tried to escape several times, but she was stopped by the lady every time. The strength she was proud of was as weak as a child in front of the other party, unable to withstand a single blow. She remembered that every time the other party stared at her, and casually recited a prayer, and then it was as if an irresistible pressure descended from the sky, penetrating the dome of the temple, and directly exerting itself on her, immobilizing her. At this moment she was sitting on a bench, which was so luxurious that it almost looked like a carved wooden throne. Even in the liege's castle, she had never seen such a beautiful chair. She stared at herself in a long mirror in front of her, although the beautiful figure in the mirror did not look like her at all. A few maids surrounded her, carefully grooming her, and Scarlet knew that she could not resist, so she just let them manipulate her like a puppet. The maids looked at their new mistress and compared her to the beauty in the mirror. They carefully combed her long hair, put on sparkling earrings and whispered to each other. Occasionally, they would let out a low chuckle, which made Scarlet's face burn. She still couldn't figure out where she was, why she was here, and why she was dressed in such strange clothes. She wanted to contact Ovina, but the young lady of the Azure Lance seemed to have other matters to attend to today. Scarlet's question sank like a stone in the ocean. Fortunately, she could still feel the presence of the Azure Lance, which made her feel a little more at ease. The maids around her were all delicate and cute, obviously carefully selected. However, most of them had long or short crimson hair of different shades, which made it clear that they were from the Azure Lance. Scarlet looked at these people she had never met before, and listened to them whispering softly in her ear. For a moment she did not want to lose her temper, so she could only be patient. Of course, this was also because she knew that the overly strict priestess was still waiting outside. "My lady," a round-faced maid said enviously, "you really are our princess, the most beautiful girl among the mountain people." "What did you call me?" Scarlet was not very good at dealing with strangers, but when she heard this, she could not help but be surprised. She asked the question almost in a daze. "Oh yes, my lady, you still don't know, right? You are the only count in the past few hundred years who was personally appointed by His Majesty. Your fief is said to be the most fertile land in the kingdom, at the edge of the wilderness of the 4 territories. Yes, yes, yes. I've seen the maple forest there before. Oh my God, it's so beautiful. I can see that His Majesty admires you very much." The maids chattered. "Most importantly, it's close to the land of our mountain people, the mountains of Valisai. I really want to go home and take a look even in my dreams." Scarlet was confused. She looked at the maids in confusion, not understanding what they were talking about. She was born in Chablis, and there were many mountain people there as well. When she was young, she did hear legends about the mountain people's homeland, the mountains of the Latch of Wa, but those were all distant dreams. She listened to the maids talk about fief, His Majesty, and the Count. Her mind was in a mess, and she could not think of anything for a while. But she could see that these girls sincerely worshipped her. They chattered to her. "My Countess, I heard that His Majesty intends to give you the autonomy of that land after you swear allegiance to him with your sword. That land in your hands is equivalent to returning to the hands of us mountain people. The independence and autonomy that we have dreamed of for thousands of years can finally be realized in your hands, my Countess." The maids discussed enthusiastically, but as they spoke, their voices became softer and softer. The mountain people's situation in the empire was not much better than in Erewhon. In fact, it was even worse. The Cruz people saw them as barbarians, and the nobles captured them as if they were wild beasts. Once the mountain men and women were chased out of the forest, they would be locked up in cages like wild beasts. They would leave their homes and be sold to other places. Those who were better off could become servants of the nobles, but most of them died in some unknown mine. Who would be willing to leave their homeland? However, the history of the resistance of the mountain people had become a legend centuries ago. Within the borders of the empire, other than a small number of clans that relied on the empire, most of them hid in the mountains and lived like wild beasts. But even the remaining ones were inferior to the nobles. They could be captured at any time for various reasons and become slaves. These seemed to be the common experiences of these girls. The room suddenly fell silent for a moment, and several of the girls could not help but sob. The round-faced maid choked and said, "My lord, do you know today, because of you we, the mountain people, no longer have to leave our homes and families, and no longer have to be hunted down by those Kurlutz people like wild beasts. My lord, your name will spread throughout the mountains of the empire, and one day you will be the hero of the mountain people." Scarlet opened her mouth. She felt that she must be dreaming. She could not help but grab the handrail as if she wanted to stand up unsteadily. She was not used to the crystal shoes on her feet. She walked like a puppet. The maids at the side hurriedly supported the princess to prevent her from stepping on their skirts and falling to the ground. This was not something that had not happened before. But Scarlet looked around and finally asked, "I don't quite understand what you are talking about. My lord, where is he?" "My lord, aren't you?" Scarlet shook her head hard and was about to refute when someone knocked on the door. Then Sydney's voice came in. "Count Mitra, if you are done dressing up, someone wants to see you." The maidservants quieted down as if they had suddenly turned into puppets. They knew who would come here at this time. Oh! Chapter 896. The autumn wind in the area south of the Ampher Mountains, which was called Ankara by the locals, was blowing gently across the vast white plains. Waves of varying depths swept across the vast sea, and the undulating hills seemed to be the waves on the sea. A young lion man riding a golden lion was standing on the peak of the waves, overlooking the shining horizon in the north of the plains. The lion he was riding was clad in magnificent armor, with beautiful ornaments hanging from its mane. It stood in the white withered grass, shaking its huge head from time to time and sneezing slightly. The White Plains were the symbol of Toquinen, and the origin of the name of the White Plains. The plains stretched from the silver sand coast to the west, to the border of the human kingdoms in the east. In the north, under the endless mountains, lay the powerful empire called Cruz. The young lion man stared in that direction. "Ne'er, we should go back. That's the limit of today's patrol area. If you go any further, I won't be able to bear the responsibility." Behind the hill, another lion man stood beside his mount and shouted to the young man on top of the hill. The young lion man replied without turning his head, "It's okay. We'll cross that place tomorrow." Its emerald-like eyes flashed with a certain light. Even by human standards, it could be considered a rather handsome lion man. Its golden mane was like a tassel, and its body was well proportioned. Although it was stronger than most humans, the lines of its muscles were very smooth. Its upper body was bare, and only its right shoulder and arm were covered in heavy armor. On its chest was a necklace made of beast teeth. The young lion man below could not see the scenery behind the mound, but he knew that there used to be a magnificent fortress there, built with pure white stones transported from the plains. Now, only the scattered debris in the grassland proved that it had once existed. "Ne'er, the humans will pay for this," he said. "Yes, Amon," the young lion man replied. With the help of her maids, Scarlet spent a lot of effort to walk through the long corridor, and finally saw the person that Sydney spoke of in a courtyard filled with birds and flowers. Unlike what she had imagined, the person in front of her was not a cold and stern noble, nor was it a graceful and luxurious lady. Instead, it was a young girl who was a little younger than herself. Aside from the coldness on her face that did not match her age, her body and face were similar to a human girl of 14 or 15 years old. Her blonde hair reached her waist, and her face was as delicate as a doll's. She wore an extremely masculine silk robe with a circle of ferret fur around the edges. The robe was extremely wide and almost dragged to the ground. The young girl looked in their direction with eyes as blue as the sea, and just a dignified gaze was enough to silence the maids. They took half a step back and let go of Scarlet, bowing respectfully, leaving Scarlet standing in place uneasily, not knowing whether she should do as she was told. "Are you the person they brought back from the south?" Constance, the Silver Queen, asked. Her voice was like a string of silver bells falling on the marble floor of the corridor, ethereal and crisp. She looked at Scarlet with a strange light in her eyes. "What a beauty! My name is Scarlet. May I ask, where is this place?" Scarlet asked in a low voice. She saw that the girl was a few years younger than herself, and the uneasiness in her heart subsided a little. She didn't think that her words would scare the maids behind her half to death. Although Her Majesty the Empress was a woman, she was colder and more emotionless than a man. They had never seen anyone who dared to speak so impudently to Her Majesty. They were afraid that this countess would accidentally anger this temperamental supreme being. But Constance did not mind. She smiled and said, "This is my palace." "What did you say?" Scarlet looked at her blankly. The maidservants who were chattering before turned pale. Her Majesty's words were so obvious, but the countess, who did not seem to care about worldly affairs, still asked, "What did you say?" What was the difference between this and calling Her Majesty's name in front of her? They could almost imagine Her Majesty's angry face, followed by the accusation and anger that would follow. They could not help but tremble like leaves in the wind. But unlike what they imagined, Constance found it very interesting. She had never seen such a simple girl in her decades of life in the palace. She looked at Scarlet, who seemed to be stunned, and a sense of pride rose in her heart. She smiled a little mischievously and said, "You didn't hear wrong. This is the White Rose Garden of St. Cantifer Palace. I think you should have heard of this place. As for me, if I were to say that this entire palace, and even the vast land outside of it, belongs to me, I'm afraid that no one would raise any objections." Constance thought that those words should have scared the poor girl out of her wits, but what she did not expect was that those words did not have as much effect on Scarlet as the previous one. That was because the mountain maiden knew what "this is my palace" meant, but she did not know the deeper meaning behind the Garden of White Roses in St. Cantifer Palace. Under the rule of the Holy Cathedral of Fire, anyone with a little knowledge would have heard of the center of power of the Cruz Empire, the White Rose Garden of St. Cantifer Palace. But unfortunately Scarlet, who grew up in the Chablis forest since she was young, was the rare exception. This place with a strong political connotation was no different from Front Gate 35 of Valhalla, or the gatehouse of the Baron's castle on the main street of Abbey's castle. Constance looked at the Highlander girl with a little disappointment. She blinked and asked her a little uneasily, "But why am I here? I was the one who asked someone to invite you here." The Silver Queen was, after all, a queen. This momentary and failed prank was like a whirlpool on the surface of water in her heart, disappearing in the blink of an eye. This sentence made Scarlet fall silent. Constance's words seemed to have injected countless chaotic memory fragments into her mind, connecting the missing pieces and forming a complete chain. She finally remembered what happened after Ovina sealed her in the invincible barrier to protect her, as well as everything that truly existed in that dream. She was transported from Lantern Island to the sea, and then passed through Grey Harbor and Yenbao. She passed through half of the empire and arrived at the political center of the empire. Finally, she was released from the crystal in the Holy Cathedral. Although she still didn't quite understand how she became a countess for no reason, she wasn't an idiot. At this moment, she realized who the young lady standing in front of her was. "Your Majesty," she answered with obvious unease. Constance nodded with satisfaction. The maids behind Scarlet finally breathed a sigh of relief. They almost patted their chests in relief. It seemed that the Count was not too stupid after all. However, Scarlet was obviously going to go against them until the end, because her next words immediately caused their mood, which had just climbed out of the abyss, to plummet to the bottom of the abyss. Constance watched as Scarlet fell silent in front of her. She frowned and clenched her fists. She raised her eyebrows slightly and asked, "I invited you here and made you a Count of the Empire. You don't seem to want to?" "I don't want to be a count, Your Majesty. I just want to go back to Erewhon." The maids almost fainted when they heard their count's words, if they were allowed to, but they were still facing Her Majesty the Empress. They could only tremble in fear, grit their teeth, and hope from the bottom of their hearts that their count would not say anything outrageous. Constance also seemed to be a little unhappy. She asked, "Why do you want to go back to Erewhon? Is it because you want to go back to that count of yours? I heard that the count is still a young man. A romantic and unrestrained person. It's only natural for a young lady like you to have feelings for him." She shook her head. "But you have to understand that you and him are destined to have no future. He has a bright future ahead of him. How could he possibly fall for you? In the future, the one who will be in his bed will either be the daughter of a duke or your princess. You, on the other hand, are destined to be a mistress who can't see the light of day. Ask yourself, is that what you want?" Scarlet widened her eyes and stared at the girl who looked a few years younger than her. She wanted to refute, but she could not open her mouth. No, in her mind, the Count was definitely not that kind of person. But what difference did it make to her? The Count already had a fiancé. The only thing she could do was to watch it all happen in silence. The Silver Queen's words pierced her heart like a sharp thorn. To be the Count's mistress, she suddenly realized that she seemed to have such delusions. No, Scarlet, you can't think like that." She hurriedly shook her head and said to herself in her heart. The Highlander girl looked up, her cheeks were already boiling hot. Constance looked on coldly and then asked, "Do you still want to go back?" Scarlet nodded. Constance's face turned cold. Do you think I'll let the Azure Lance leave the Empire, little girl? I'd rather destroy it than let such a thing happen. Her voice was so cold that it was penetrating. The majesty of a supreme being that had accumulated over the years almost made the Highlander girls behind Scarlet tremble. They were like sifting chaff, as if they would collapse at any time. But Scarlet stubbornly looked at Her Majesty. Her gaze seemed to have answered the question. Even if she died, she would die by Brando's side. Constance did not find it difficult to feel her determination. She snorted coldly. It's not hard for you to die, but aren't you afraid of dragging your count down with you? He has a bright future ahead of him. The Highlander girl trembled, clenching her fists and looking at her angrily. Constance looked at Scarlet and could not help but shake her head. She looked up and said to the frightened maids, "You can leave now." The maids hurriedly bowed and retreated, but they could not help but sneak glances at Scarlet before they left, as if they were afraid that the Countess, who did not care about worldly affairs, would offend Her Majesty too much and accidentally lose her head. The round-faced maid even risked her life to grab Scarlet's hand and gave it a squeeze. This little gesture naturally fell into Constance's eyes, but the young queen completely ignored it. After the maids had all left, she said, "Although it's the first time we met, I can see that they care about you. Do you know the situation of the Highlanders in the Empire?" Scarlet was not a puppet, and naturally could feel the concern from the girls of her tribe. She was slightly touched but still did not say a word. "What a stubborn little girl," Constance replied. "But there is no benefit for you to insist on this. You are a Count of the Empire today and you will always be a Count of the Empire. Whether you accept this identity or not, you will have to pledge your loyalty to my sword." She then warned, "I can tell you clearly, Scarlet, from today onwards, if you dare to take half a step out of the White Rose Garden of St. Cantifer Palace, I will send troops to attack Erewhon and hang your beloved Count." Scarlet's face was pale as she stared at her in disbelief. However, the Empire's queen did not seem to mind and continued, "Of course, when you swear your loyalty to me, I will give you the land of the wilderness of the Four Realms as your fief. But remember, you don't have much time left. You don't want to gamble the future of your Lord Brando, do you?" When the Highlander girl heard that name, her whole body became wobbly. For a moment she felt like the world was spinning, and her heart was at a loss. But she did not know where the courage came from. But she suddenly gritted her teeth and raised her hand. The emerald holy spear suddenly appeared in her hand. She let out a beastly growl and raised the spear to stab Constance's abdomen. The azure spear almost pierced through the Silver Queen, and at that moment Scarlet seemed to have lost all her strength. She gasped for breath, but when she looked up, she saw that Constance's face showed no signs of pain. Instead, she looked at her coldly and said, "My Countess, is this your answer?" "You." Scarlet looked at the spear in her hand in a daze. Constance raised a hand and placed it on the azure spear, and then pulled the blade out of her body inch by inch. She looked at her blood-stained abdomen, and then looked at the Highlander girl, and shook her head in disappointment. "You are recognized by the Azure Knight. You and your azure spear can't hurt me. Go, you need to wake up. But remember my words, if you dare to act rashly again, I'll be the first to kill Erewhon." Scarlet was almost scared out of her wits, and she looked like she was at a loss. "Guards!" Constance covered her abdomen with one hand and shouted coldly, "Take Count Mitra away." In just a moment, the Silver Queen watched the guards take Scarlet away, and finally there was a look of unwillingness in her eyes. She gently bared her teeth, and only then did she release the hand on her abdomen. Her palm was already blood-red. However, she did not summon a priest or a doctor. Instead, she looked behind a bush in the garden and said coldly, "Come out, what are you sneaking around for?" In just a moment, the bush there rustled, and a person in the attire of a chamberlain came out. The person looked at Her Majesty with some fear, and asked respectfully, "Your Majesty, are you all right? Do you want? Who told you that you can talk glibly in front of me?" Constance interrupted him. "What are you doing hiding there? Are all the people outside who sent the message dead?" "Your Majesty, of course not, because it's a secret message from the wilderness of the Four Realms." The person was shocked, and quickly answered submissively, "A secret message from the wilderness of the Four Realms." Constance frowned. "What's the matter with the elves again? The person quickly came closer and whispered a few words into her ear. Constance listened, and her face darkened slightly. Is this letter absolutely authentic? Yes, Your Majesty. In the north of Yanalassu and the Grey Mountains, the Lionmen's attacks were decreasing day by day. This situation was very unusual as the situation in the north was getting more and more tense by the day. The human scouts headed north, and soon found an unprecedented army on the grasslands. This army was gathering from all directions and was now heading north, approaching the Amphbar Pass. This news quickly crossed the glittering sea, crossed Ampere Seal in the south, and went deep into the interior, and spread to those who needed it. Brando. When the princess called out to Brando in the courtyard, he was preparing a saddle for the horse. Brando saw Princess Griffine coming out of the house and could not help but be slightly startled. Your Highness, I was just about to go to your place. Are you here to say goodbye to me? Brando scratched his head in a very ungentlemanly manner. Although he did intend to do so, it was quite awkward to be pointed out by the princess. Speaking of which, this was his home, and the princess was his guest. It was a little rude to leave her alone while he was in a hurry to return to his territory. But now was not the time for him to care about his manners. I'm sorry, Your Highness. My subordinate has been missing for quite some time and I have to hurry. He could only answer in this way. Princess Griffine was slightly dissatisfied. That evening when you slammed the door in my study, you were not so polite. I slammed the door. Brando was shocked. If he dared to slam the door in front of the princess, he would not be able to escape the title of a powerful official. That night he was just too lazy to talk nonsense with Makarov and left first. How did it turn into slamming the door? Princess Griffine looked at him quietly. Brando, you and the royal faction have different views. This is not a big deal and I understand your ideals. But the old nobles are deeply rooted in the kingdom, and the royal faction is also a part of them. You have offended them time and time again, and they may not let you go. Brendel was a little disdainful. He knew too well about the old nobles that the princess was talking about in his previous life. They were a bunch of useless people. The royal faction was considered to have some achievements among them, but that was all there was to it. He shrugged. I'm just expressing my opinion. As for the courage of Mr. Makarov and the others, I admire it very much, but I don't dare to compliment them. Today, Cruz can take away one person from the kingdom, and tomorrow they can take away even more. If Erewhon can't even protect its people, then what dignity does this ancient kingdom have? I understand, Griffine replied. But Brando, what do you plan to do? Do you really want to declare war on the Empire? Are you here to dissuade me, Your Highness? Griffine shook her head lightly. I can't dissuade you, but I believe you know what to do, right, Brando? Brendel could hear the helplessness in Her Highness's tone, and his momentum could not help but weaken a little. Showing off in front of a lady did not seem to be something to be proud of. He was silent for a moment, then nodded and said, I'm not that blind yet. Whether the war or not depends on the attitude of the Empire, but I have to bring my subordinates back from the hands of the Kurluts. After that, it's hard to say if Her Majesty the Queen will be furious. But no matter what, Erewhon needs to be prepared for war. The princess let out a sigh of relief. I knew you would know what to do. She paused for a moment. Then, I'll appoint you as the leader of Erewhon's diplomatic group. What do you think, Count? Brando saw the princess looking up at him, and there seemed to be a cunning glint in her silver eyes. He couldn't help but be a little surprised. Diplomatic group? What diplomatic group? He couldn't wrap his head around it for a moment. Could it be that in order to get back the hostages, the princess even formed a diplomatic group to denounce the Empire? Wait, isn't this a little too ridiculous? He originally wanted to bring a small group of people to sneak into the Empire and secretly rescue Scarlet. But the princess' idea was much better than his. This was a slap to the Empire's face. Your Highness, this is a little inappropriate. Brendel was taken aback and carefully chose his words before replying. Why? Well. Brendel thought about it and felt that this princess might be a little too idealistic. He had to explain. The Kurlutzians are still quite prideful, and the Silver Queen is even more so. If we do this, won't we put them in a difficult position? What are you thinking, Brando? The princess looked at him in surprise. I'm asking you to be the envoy of the participating countries of the Holy Cathedral of Fire to go to Erewhon in the Holy War. Holy War? Brando couldn't help but cry out. The Holy War has begun? P.S. Today's chapter is 6,000 words again, so I'm a little late. Everyone please vote. It's the end of the month again. Also, tomorrow is the Sword Spirit Open Beta. If you want to play, you can come to the Bamboo Forest Coast. I'm the unapproachable Fergie, the 36th assassin. Let's play together. Chapter 897. The First Holy War generally referred to the War of the Holy Saints that took place 1,000 years ago. The 4 Holy Saints led the people of Black Iron to resist the cruel rule of the Dark Dragon. It was a glorious and sacred war praised by countless songs. The Second Holy War began at the end of the Year of Chaos. It was a sacred war launched by the Fanzon, the Crews, and the Wind Elves to open up the vast wilderness and dark forests between the 3 kingdoms. That was the era of the Pioneer Knight. The magnificent and heroic songs in the wilderness lasted until the establishment of Erewhon. After that, the territories of the 3 empires were basically formed. The only thing left between the kingdoms was the narrow dark forest as a buffer zone. This war was also magnificent and lasted for nearly 2 centuries. Thus, the name of the Holy War was established. The Third Holy War began in the Year of Glory and lasted for nearly half a century. However, it turned out that this war was neither glorious nor honorable, especially the November War in the last 7 years. Bloodshed became the only memory people had of this war. The reason for the start of the war was the magical technology brought by the Hazel people. The introduction of the new technology made the kingdoms enter the most prosperous era. However, the hidden dangers brought by the expansion of the population also appeared one by one. When the population began to flow into the borders, the empires had to turn their attention to the remaining undeveloped areas. Since the Year of Glory, the 3 empires, in accordance with the Sacred Covenant, jointly marched to the border of the wilderness of 4 territories. The war began in the south of the Alkash Mountains, but it turned out to be a terrible mistake. Throughout the war, because of the contradictions of land division, the distrust of the royal family, and the growing conflict between the teachings of the Holy Cathedral, and the all-for-one believers who stirred up trouble and bewitched people's hearts, in the 320th year of the First Era, the Year of Change, the local army of the Crews people suddenly attacked the Wind Elves, who were their allies. On the surface, this battle was revenge for an earlier conflict, but there was no lack of all-for-one shadows. Then the human army on the Wind Elves' side also retaliated, completely intensifying the conflict. Humans and Wind Elves fought each other on the long and narrow battlefield. All-for-one's high-ranking nobles who had infiltrated the Society of Order played an indispensable role in the battle, but when most of the nobles came to their senses, the result was already too late. But in fact, in a way it reflected the human heart. The scholar of Rune Castle, Ron Similian, wrote in his book, "People too often shift the blame to some evil force, instead of reflecting on their own mistakes. In fact, history has long proven that this force only played a role in the whole process of the war, but it only exposed the ugly side of human nature." This statement described the scene of the war at that time. After 6 months, the Fanzon people joined the war, and then the Lion people of Toquinen, duchies and kingdoms of all sizes were drawn into the vortex. The war dragged all the participants into an endless battle, because of hatred, greed, or other reasons, until they exhausted each other. After the war, the Crews people occupied the entire wilderness of the 4 realms and a small part of the 4-leaf clover plains, including a large piece of land that originally belonged to the Wind Elves. The Fanzon people were the biggest winners, reaping benefits from both sides. The Lion people solved their need for hatred, and many duchies were enslaved in the war, either because of the greed of the imperial nobles, or because of the war's progress. On the surface, it seemed that the Second Holy War had ended around the Year of the Cave Beasts, but in fact, the seeds of deeper hatred had been planted long ago. The last trust between the empires was lost, and the friction on the border was increasing day by day. Almost everyone knew that the 3 beasts just needed a short rest because they had lost their strength, and each of them could not wait to jump up and bite each other to death. The Crews people needed to pay for the bloodshed by the nobles in the last 7 years of the November War. Although they gained benefits from the war, it was more painful. This pain made the nobles become impetuous and angry, and made them want to free themselves from the dishonorable war, and punish the Fanzan people and the Wind Elves. This atmosphere made the Cruise people to increase their exploitation of the small countries, and also allowed the All-for-One to infiltrate a wider market. However, for the Wind Elves it was also a deep-rooted hatred, whether it was for the Fanzan people or the Cruise people. They lost their territory in the war, and naturally they wanted to take it back. The Fanzan people, the only ones who wanted to maintain the results of the last war, gradually became impatient because of the constant provocation from the Cruise people and the Wind Elves on the border. The Fourth Holy War, or rather the Third Holy War. Due to the disreputable influence of the Third Holy War, more and more people were unwilling to associate the subsequent holy wars with the War of the Holy Saints, especially scholars. Many of them did not regard the War of the Holy Saints as the same kind of war for territorial expansion, but took it out from history and put it aside. Therefore, the pain caused by the Second Holy War was destined to break out in the Third Holy War. This was something that all countries had expected, but when it really started, it was earlier than everyone expected. At the end of July, the deadly frost forest exploded. On the same day, Toquinen, Voles, and Perkins were bombarded by the 14 Circle Spell God's judgment. The casualties were countless, and the 3 cities were almost reduced to ashes. Within the next 2 months, the Golden Lion Mane Beastmen began to gather an army. Their attack started from the Grey Mountain Range in the south, Yanalassu, and crossed the White Plains and began to march towards Kurlutz. At the beginning of the month of frost, the Lion Mane Beastmen left the Warm Plains and arrived at the Lion Fortress. News of the coming war spread throughout the Kurlutz Empire within half a month. In the same month, the Wind Elves' revenge army set out from the ruins of Perkins and ambushed the Cruise people's Crimson Army on the Four-Leaf Grass Plain. The Wind Elves quickly recovered several towns and fortresses on the Four-Leaf Grass Plain, and entered a stalemate with the Cruise people on the border of the Wilderness of Four Realms. As for the Fanzan people, although they did not act on the surface, their army had already begun to gather from White City in gray hues. When Constance and Vala's order to summon the envoys and nobles of the Holy Cathedral of Fire to Rushta arrived, Brando knew that the second chapter of the game, the Age of War and Chaos, had come early. Her Royal Highness decided on the candidates for the envoys in the shortest time possible. First of all, the leader of the envoys was naturally Brando. Although there were many voices of dissent in the royal faction, Griffine suppressed all of them. She knew the real purpose of Brando's trip, and she supported the Earl's decision. Most of the opponents of the royal faction thought that this was a childish and impulsive action, but she did not think so. Brando's words of "this is the pride and backbone of a nation" finally moved her. She knew that the kingdom needed some pride of its own. Griffine knew that such a flag would allow her to gain some people who truly supported her, and not those cowardly nobles. They had already parted ways with her in Ampere Seal, and she did not have the slightest bit of hope in her heart. If the nobles of a kingdom did not stand with her, then she should at least stand with its citizens. Brando's words were like a beacon in the darkness for her. Next, the Royal Highness still stubbornly chose Haruz. This made Brando feel a little flattered. He was very clear about the rules between the nobles of Wond, so he was also very clear about the reason why the Royal Highness made this choice. It was because Haruz was the future Crown Prince of Erewhon, and Cruz could not detain him in the Empire. Otherwise, the Silver Queen would not only offend all of her vassal states, but also leave a very bad reputation among the nobles of the Empire. But there were still some risks in doing so. The Crown Prince's travels were full of unstable factors, and Prince Leneret, who was still living in seclusion in Tonagel, was a ready-made example. But Griffine was determined to let her beloved brother take the risk to protect Brando, the head of the diplomatic mission, because she knew very well what Brando meant to Erewhon at this moment. If he died in Cruz, then her and Haruz's future would also be bleak. She was very clear about what she was going to do, and in her opinion as the future king of Erewhon, it was also time for Haruz to take responsibility for the future of the kingdom. This was what she said to her only brother. Haruz, this diplomatic experience of you and your teacher is likely to be the most precious wealth of your life. Haruz, this may be the last time I tell you that you have to be strong alone because you are the king of Erewhon. The little prince had no objection, but he was frightened by his sister's sternness and almost cried. But when Princess Griffine glared at him fiercely, he swallowed his tears back into his stomach and nodded honestly. Brando, on the other hand, returned to Tanajil with some gratitude to the princess and began to choose the attendants and deputies who would accompany him. He knew very well that this so-called diplomatic mission was just a pretense. What he really wanted to do was clear to everyone around him. Therefore, this so-called diplomatic mission did not need etiquette officers full of aristocratic etiquette, but an army that could turn crews upside down. This army did not have many people, and he already had a suitable candidate in mind. Since almost all the funds in the territory have been invested in the preparation for war, mainly the recruitment and training of the White Lion Guards, the forging of weapons and armor, and the expenditure of magic crystals, daily maintenance, the acquisition of rare materials, etc. In short, the construction in the Black Forest has basically come to a halt. This situation will last for about 3 to 4 months, and at the latest in half a year, our previous achievements will be shaken. The carriage was shaking, and the shadows of the forest passed through the window, leaving mottled patterns on the black robes as the carriage moved forward. Brando's face was bright and dark under the crisscrossing light. He supported his chin with one hand as he listened to the merchant lady read a report to him, which was rare for the little Roman. Her small eyebrows were knitted together. As part of her interest as a merchant, she did not mind reading a mountain of books or similar documents, but reading them out loud and turning them into audiobooks, she began to feel a little thirsty. But this was what Brando wanted her to do. She used this reason to convince herself for about 5 minutes or 10 seconds, but she immediately found a new excuse. Brando always liked to see her in a difficult position, and this made her very unhappy. The Roman began to realize that the Roman was unhappy. She raised her feathery eyebrows and quickly moved her mouth as she read. The White Lion Guard suffered about 100 casualties in the previous war. Brando glared at her. Wait, what did you say in the second half? I didn't hear you clearly. That's what I said in the second half, isn't it? It's just that I read it too fast so you didn't hear it clearly. But I've finished reading it. Romain began to act shamelessly as usual. You're cheating. Didn't you say that you would read the report to me this afternoon? I have to know what happened in the territory during this time. Brando replied in a bad mood. But I've already finished reading it. I used the method my aunt taught me, the witch's reading method. If Brando didn't hear it clearly, then Brando isn't a witch. That has nothing to do with the Roman. She rolled her black eyes and stuffed a stack of reports into Falern's hands. But you can let Falern read it for you. She doesn't know the witch's reading method, so Brando doesn't have to worry about not hearing it clearly. Brendel was sure that the witch's ability to read things so quickly must have popped up from some random corner of her brain, but this merchant girl's imagination was too rich, to the point that she could use the same name differently. He rolled his eyes and was too lazy to expose her, because she would definitely be able to justify herself in the end. This was Lord Romain's special skill, rolling all over the floor, and normal people would not be able to learn it. He looked at Falern, who was sitting opposite the two of them, ignoring the 2 clowns in front of her. She silently tidied up the report and continued to read. The White Lion Guard's casualties have been replenished by new recruits from the Tanajil and Maxin region. In addition, the new recruits have been expanded by 500 people, making a total of 1,500 people. However, these new recruits are still training in Tanajil and Ranner, so they won't be able to be used for the time being. Good job, Carglass, Brando praised. The scenery outside the carriage had already changed to a tranquil mountain forest. It was already the 2nd day since he returned to Tanajil. He stretched himself in the carriage and found that he felt more relaxed after returning to his territory. Although it was very warm in Braggs's house, it was still very awkward in front of his father. After all, this was his territory that he built with his own hands. He originally wanted his parents to move to Tanajil, but old Scott stubbornly refused to accept. His mother Windsor seemed to be tempted, but in the end she did not agree. Fortunately, Bunai promised to send people to take care of his family. With the protection of the Highland Knight, he did not have to worry about Madara's possible revenge. In the end, Princess Griffine did not succeed in her resignation. Since Princess Griffine arranged for him to be the leader of the diplomatic group to cruise, she naturally had to personally come to Tanajil to inspect the group that he selected to go to the Empire. She wanted to prevent the Count from bringing an army to cruise. Of course, this was only an excuse on the surface. In fact, it was somewhat against the rules for the princess to go to a vassal's territory in private. It would also negatively affect her reputation. However, everyone knew that Tanajul and Radnor's territories were close to Frada. It was not unreasonable for her to insist on taking a detour from Tanajul. However, Brando knew that Her Royal Highness would not leave easily after coming to Abes this time. His departure from Erewhon to Cruz was an unstable factor in the kingdom's situation. At least on the surface, in the eyes of the world, Tanajul was still standing behind the princess. If he, Count Tanajul, was not in the kingdom for a short period of time, then she was likely to face the danger of being taken over by the royal faction again. She came to his territory this time with the mentality of inspecting the rear, and also to show the world that she had a close relationship with the Count of Tanajul. Brando did not think too much about these considerations of the princess at first. He only thought that the princess was here to bid him farewell, but after Amandina's reminder, he understood. In fact, Tanajul and the royal family were interdependent. When he was not in the kingdom, his territory especially needed to be recognized by the royal family. This was related to the legitimacy of the territory, and to prevent the royal faction from taking advantage of the situation. Thus, after understanding the princess' considerations, he tacitly began to cooperate with her. For this reason, Princess Grafine conferred him the title of Count Randner on the first day she arrived in Tanajul. This was actually a compensation title, because Tanajul was never a count's territory. Originally, Brando did not have any ambitions for Randner. In his original plan, it was best for Randner and Erek to be merged into the royal family's territory to further strengthen the central authority, and also to set an example for other places. Furthermore, Erek had the second best source of soldiers in the kingdom. The Highlanders, Erewhon's main source of soldiers, came from the Grey Mountains, and Randner was the most prosperous territory in the south other than Ampere Seal. With these two territories, the royal family could be said to have a significant say in Erewhon. As for himself, the title of Count Tanajul was just a pretense. The land of order in the loop of trade winds was almost half the size of the southern border, and when it was fully developed, it would not be difficult to create another Erewhon. The key was that it contained a lot of valuable minerals and resources, so he had no interest in managing other territories. However, Princess Grafine dispelled his thoughts. She sternly told him that the title of Count was not only a reward, but also a recognition. With his current status and relationship with her, if he did not receive the title of Count Randner today, it would easily arouse suspicion from the outside world, and cause unrest in the kingdom. Not only would it not strengthen the royal family's authority, but it would also cause the reputation of the House of Covardo to fall to the ground, and at the same time, it would also shake the legitimacy of Tanajul. After listening to her explanation, Brando realized that his thoughts were a little too naive, and he had no choice but to follow her advice. After receiving Count Randner's title, he also received a portion of the command rights of the Southern Legion. The expansion of the Southern Legion was carried out under this name. Princess Grafine pretended not to see it, and did not mention a word about the ownership of the Southern Army that was currently recuperating in Ampere Seal. Brando also pretended to forget this point, and the two maintained a tacit understanding to put on this show. The outsiders thought that these two young people did not understand the workings of the kingdom's local forces, and almost no one, including the royal faction, reminded them of this point. It was as if they were waiting to see them make a fool of themselves. However, many people in Trentheim understood that their liege had obviously received some sort of instruction, and was preparing to clean up the mess caused by the nobles in the southern border, the mutual restraint and hindrance between the forces of the armies. However, this plan had just begun, and Brando had no choice but to put it aside and hand it over to Carglass or Princess Grafine. After all, Cruz's people had caused a lot of trouble for him. He interrupted the wild elf sister in front of him and asked directly, "In terms of preparations for war, we can slow down a little bit. If we really want to go to war with Cruz's people, it will not be just Tanajul's problem, and Princess Grafine will find a way to help. The focus of resources and funds should be placed on Valhalla. Falern, if I need to use all the Valkyries, how long can the territory last? If we slow down the pace of other aspects, with the supply of magic crystals in the Black Forest, it should not be a problem to last for a year, my lord." Falern replied without a change in her expression. What if we want to maintain the construction in the Black Forest? 3 months to half a year. Brando nodded. What about the materials that you want to purchase? Currently, there are only phoenix wings and singing silver, and they are very scarce. As for the other materials that my lord wants, there is no news yet. Falerne looked at him and said, Author's note, these few chapters have been a little difficult to write, and because of the long duration of the plot, I uploaded them a little late. Please forgive me. Also, seeing that I have been working hard for the past few days, I ask for monthly votes. Chapter 899. The carriage soon arrived at Valhalla and stopped in the central district after passing through a gate on the huge tree roots. Brando looked at the scenery outside and gestured to Falerne to stop. He opened the door, jumped out of the carriage, and saw the little prince waiting not far away. Teacher. Haruz bowed respectfully to Brando with the courtesy a student should have. Behind him stood Maynard, and another figure in a white linen robe who looked like an ancient Greek goddess, but with snake hair and prismatic eyes. She was a Medusa. Brando had heard of this Medusa named Lysimachia, but today was the first time he met her face to face. Your Highness, how has your swordsmanship improved in the past 2 months? Haruz's face turned red, and he could not answer. It didn't seem to be very good. Brando smiled and patted the little prince on the shoulder. Don't worry, it's okay. At this time, several green vines hung down from the canopy of Valhalla, hundreds of meters high. These vines were as thick as an arm, and the ends were intertwined to form a basket. Brando let Haruz, Maynard, and the little Roman ride in one basket with him, and the rest of the people ride in another. After he gave an order, the vines began to rise slowly. Although it was not the first time the little Roman had taken this kind of transportation, she was still looking around excitedly. She swung the rattan basket in the air and shouted, scaring Haruz so much that he clutched the edge of the basket tightly. But when it reached a certain height, the merchant girl also clutched the edge of the basket tightly and obediently stayed still. Swordsmanship is not everything, Haruz. Brando looked at the gradually shrinking hills and brown forest under his feet and continued the previous topic. If I remember correctly, after next month you will be 13 years old. Haruz looked at his teacher with some confusion and nodded. Starting next month, I will teach you magic. Magic? Haruz was slightly stunned. I can learn magic too, teacher? Of course. Brando nodded and said no more. Suddenly, he felt a gaze on him and realized that Maynard was staring at him. The female knight seemed to have recovered from her injuries. Today, she was wearing a tight military uniform and looked very heroic. What's wrong, miss? Maynard? Brando asked. You plan to teach His Royal Highness magic? Have you reported this to Her Royal Highness? Maynard asked. Not yet, but Haruz is very talented in magic. He has wasted too much time on the path of swordsmanship. Why not try another path? 13 years old is too late to learn swordsmanship, but it is the right time to learn magic. Who knows, he might become an outstanding wizard in the future. He laughed. As for Her Royal Highness, I will report this to her. The rattan basket quickly rose to the top. There were many wooden trestles extending from the central square, making it convenient for the people in the rattan basket to step on. Amandina, who had arrived at Valhalla first, was already waiting for them. She was holding a pile of unknown parchments, and behind her was Tia and the rest of the Tiger Sparrow mercenaries. When she saw Brando, Roman, and Falerne, Tia was pleasantly surprised and called out to her sister. Amandina gave him a look. Brando understood and asked, They're here. Amandina nodded her head. Where are they? Brando asked. Lady Tanya doesn't like noisy places, so I arranged for her to rest in the side hall. If she didn't like noisy places, why would she open a shop in downtown Ampierseal? Brando shook his head in confusion. Let's go see her first. As expected, the nominal owner of the item arrived as scheduled. When Amandina pushed open an arched door with a carved pattern on the surface, a fairy lady was sitting peacefully on the round wooden table in the side hall. She knelt on the cushion. A small cushion was specially prepared for her on the table. On a tea table the size of a box was a small white porcelain tea set filled with fragrant tea. When she saw Brando and the others behind Amandina, she turned back, held the teacup with both hands, took a sip and then gently put it down. The council is very dissatisfied, little one. The fairy lady's first words silenced the hall. Medusa Lasmika stared at the silver star brooch on the fairy lady's chest as if she had been pricked. Originally, not everyone agreed to leave the azure lance with you for protection. It was Master William and I who found a way to persuade the council to stand against the majority, but now you've put us in a passive position. Aunt Tanya, this isn't all our fault. I think you should understand that. Brando motioned for Ferlin to close the door and replied innocently, "Back then, you promised me that the illusion you cast on the azure lance would never be seen through by anyone, unless that person was a living sage. But now that living sage is still in Eloranta, and your lance has been stolen by Cruz's people." Tanya raised her eyelids and looked at him with some surprise through her silver-rimmed glasses. "Don't talk nonsense, little one. If you hadn't used it to deal with a real god, how could the illusion on the azure lance have dissipated? But Scarlet wasn't around at the time. If it can't even withstand a little fluctuation of divine power, I think this so-called strongest illusion is a bit too unworthy of its name, isn't it? If I tell Luoan what you said exactly, do you think he'll come looking for you like a mad lion?" Tanya was almost amused by this sophistry. "A little fluctuation of divine power from your mouth destroyed 3 cities, and blew up the deadly tundra into a barren land. Don't think we don't know." She knocked on the white porcelain teacup and asked, "This cup is good. Why do you have a fairy tea set here? Did you prepare it especially for me?" "That's for the light spirits." Brando glanced at the tea set and answered casually, "You're just like your grandfather. You don't know how to make a woman happy at all." Tanya rolled her eyes at him. "The council means that the azure lance must be taken back. Isn't that simple?" Brando continued. "With your strength, you can easily subdue the Holy Cathedral of Fire. The azure lance is ours to begin with. In this matter, Cruz's people are the ones in the wrong. If you come forward and ask them to return it, I'm sure they won't dare to refuse." "Naive little one, it's not that simple," Tanya replied. "Although Buga is the most powerful country in the world, Cruz's people are not to be underestimated. The land under the control of the Holy Cathedral of Fire is vast and the population is large. The enmity between 2 such large forces involves a series of complicated issues, not to mention war. To tell you the truth, little one, the possibility of persuading the council is 0. Then you want to take back the azure lance, don't you?" Brando said softly, "I see. You're counting on me again." The fairy squinted at him. "Stop pretending. You already knew, didn't you?" Brando smiled without embarrassment. "But Aunt Tanya, you can see that I can't be a match for the behemoth that is the Cruz Empire, unless someone is helping Erwin behind the scenes." "Apart from direct intervention," Tanya began. "Apart from direct intervention," Brando repeated affirmatively. "Tell us, what do you want us to do?" Brando gestured to Amandina, who was beside him. Amandina hurriedly unfolded the rolls of parchment she had been holding in her arms and spread them on the table. They were several drawings. The fairy flipped them open one by one and understood after reading them. "Cruz's frigate. You want us to help you build this thing?" She leaned over the drawings and looked back at Brando. Brando nodded, then shook his head. "I want you to help me build 10 of these frigates. Of course you'll pay for them. But more than that, I want you to help me build a large magic dock in Valhalla. This magic dock must have the technical standards after the Year of Thunder. It must be able to build at least the smallest type for battleships. The dock must have a gargoyle casting workshop that can provide at least a brigade of gargoyles for the dock and port as an air defense force. At the same time, you'll also help this dock train the 3rd phase of shipwrights in supporting professional wizards." Tanya glanced at him in surprise. "You seem to know a lot about magic shipbuilding?" "A little," Brando replied somewhat proudly. "I just don't want to be deceived." "A piece of cake. Any city in Buga has the ability to build a dock like this for you alone. We won't go as far as to cheat for something like this." Tanya casually flipped through the crew's frigate drawings that Brando and Amandina regarded as treasures. She replied with some disdain, "Only you would look up to this kind of rubbish drawings." "Rubbish? Cruz's technology comes from the Wind Elves. Don't tell me you don't know who taught the Wind Elves their magic warship technology?" Of course Brando knew. In this world, only Buga's craftsmen could have such confidence. One of the two poles of Won's magic engineering technology was now in front of him. He took a light breath and asked, "Are you saying that you can help us build a Type 1 battleship? The Dragon of Akigash class?" How do you know about the Dragon of Akigash class?" Tanya asked with some surprise. Of course not. The Dragon of Akigash class was the latest type of battleship that Buga had been building since the Cold Moon era. It was also the revolutionary main ship of the future Slate War. Of course, Brando did not count on it. It was just a casual remark. He asked again, "What about the older ones?" "That's also impossible." "What about the frigate?" Tanya shook her head. "Little guy, just give up. The Silver Council only cares about themselves. It's already an exception that they're willing to help you. It's impossible to convince those old guys. Even if they help you build a magic dock, they can only use the Wind Elves or Cruise's technology. As for the gargoyles anyway, it's already leaked technology before the Second Holy War, so it won't be too difficult. As for the rest, don't think too much." "Sigh," Brando sighed, as if he had already expected this. "If that's the case, Aunt Tanya, why do you have to ignite my hope?" "Because you're an idiot," the fairy replied snappily. "Although we can't do it, someone else can." "Who?" "The Hazel people. The Hazel people are Cruise's mortal enemies. If one day you really stand on the opposite side of the Empire, I can find a way to contact them for you. I'm sure those arrogant shorties will be happy to help you become a thorn in the Empire's side." She glanced at Brando and replied, "You don't look down on their technology, do you?" Of course I look down on them." Brando reacted and was overjoyed. What a joke, one of the two extremes of magic technology. How would he dare to look down on it? It's just that the Hazel people had little contact with the outside world, so he didn't dare to think about it. Tanya patted the blueprint and asked again, "So this is all you want?" Brando immediately shook his head. "Of course not, Aunt Tanya. Naturally, I can't take 10 frigates to the Empire to take back the Azure Lance. This previous request is only the premise of our cooperation. It's to guard against the possible retaliation the Empire may launch against Erewhon after I take back the Azure Lance. And I'm going to take back the Azure Lance. This is a difficult task in itself, and I need your unreserved support." The fairy looked at him with a look that said, "I knew you would say that," and said, "You're not going to say that you need a battleship to go to the Empire to take back the Azure Lance, are you?" Brando smiled awkwardly. Obviously, she had hit the nail on the head. He hurriedly shook his head and said, "Of course not. I just want some small things, Aunt Tanya." After reaching a preliminary consensus, the subsequent discussion was much easier. Of course, this ease was relative to one side. When the 2-hour bargaining process flashed by, Brando was satisfied, but Tanya's expression did not look good. If your grandfather was half as smart as you, he wouldn't have ended up like that. These were the original words of a certain fairy. Of course, although she seemed very dissatisfied, she still accepted Brando's request to stay for the banquet hosted by Valhalla. After all, both sides knew very well that these deals were just a drop in the ocean for Buga. And when Amandina followed Brando out of the side hall of Valhalla's town hall, she couldn't help but wonder if she was still in a dream. Although she had long been used to big scenes, she still asked Brando in a low voice in disbelief, "My lord, Lady Tanya really agreed to give us 1,000 gargoyles?" Brando nodded. "And 300 steel golems?" Brando nodded again. "And ether dragons?" Brando probably guessed the thoughts of his lady aide. He turned back and replied, "We're just helping the Buga deal with the inventory. These things are outdated technology to them. Every year they're overstocked in the warehouse, and they need to pay for maintenance. Even if they're scrapped, it still costs a lot of money. On the other hand, they're more profitable by giving them to us. After all, they're not giving them away for free, and we still have to work for them." "But those are gargoyles, my lord. In the early years in Erewhon, if any noble had a gargoyle as a guard in their castle, it would be an incomparably glorious thing. It's incredible that we have so many at once." Amandina could hardly imagine that these things were just junk that Brando said the Buga were eager to get rid of. It was as if until this moment, she had a direct understanding of the power of the legendary Silver Kingdom. Of course, she also had a stronger understanding of her lord's exorbitant demands. If it were her, she would never dare to ask the Buga for such an exorbitant price. But in fact, compared to these things, Brando was more concerned about the small deal at the end. He hoped that Tanya would come forward to help him collect some special materials that Valhalla urgently needed. In terms of the richness of collections in the world, there was probably no one who could compare to the white-bearded wizards of the Silver Alliance. It took a while for Amandina to recover from her dizziness. She rubbed her forehead and asked in a low voice, "My lord, where shall we go next?" Brando nodded. "Cruz's people gave us trouble, so we naturally have to give them some trouble," he replied. Let's go see Prince Leneret." The two left the side hall one after the other. Behind them, Prince Haruz was about to follow but was grabbed by the arm. The little prince looked back at Medusa Lysimachia, who grabbed him in confusion and asked, "Sister Lysimachia, what's the matter?" Lysimachia put a finger to her lips and gestured for him to be quiet. She hissed and whispered, "That count is your teacher?" Haruz nodded. "Does he support you to be king?" Haruz shook his head. "I don't want to be king, Sister Lysimachia, but don't tell my sister, she'll scold me." "Well, little one," Lysimachia patted his little head, "whether you want to be king or not, you must hold on tight to your teacher. In your little country, I'm afraid no one can be more capable than him." "What's the matter, Sister Lysimachia?" Haruz was a little puzzled. "Nothing," Lysimachia suddenly asked. "Little prince, can you let me go with you to that whatever empire?" "Didn't you not want to go, Sister Lysimachia?" "I've changed my mind." "Oh," Haruz said, "I think it should be okay. I can pick a few people to accompany me. I'll let Madame Wenze stay." "Thank you, little one." Medusa Lysimachia licked her lips with her forked tongue and looked strangely in the direction Brando left. It's interesting to be able to command the Bugas. Oh. Chapter 900. The residence that Brando arranged for Prince Leneret was located on the east side of Valhalla, in a palace formed by hollowing out the trunk of a tree. This was one of Valhalla's abilities. As long as one paid a certain amount of mana in the town hall, the tree fortress would be able to create an unlimited number of caverns. Of course, to turn these caverns into rooms, one would need to decorate them. Brendel asked Amandina and Odom to design a palace that was modeled after Coldwood Castle to serve as Valhalla's guest rooms. Now this luxurious guest room was exclusively occupied by the eldest prince of the Cruz people. Outside the guest room, day or night, there were Cruz's folded sword knights guarding it in shifts. Most of these folded sword knights knew Brando, and after notifying him and getting Leneret's approval, they respectfully let him in. The entrance to the palace was cleverly arranged. It was located on a terrace connected by a vine path. The other end of the path connected to the second level of the treetop square above. The entrance was very remote and guarded by tree elf archers. Right in front of the terrace was the main branch of the giant tree that extended upward. In that direction, there were tree elf archers' outposts and tree houses hidden between the branches, but through the lush shade on both sides of the branches, one could still see the scenery of the mountains in the clouds to the east. It could be said that both safety and the owner of the place could enjoy the wonderful scenery. It was an excellent design. At the entrance, there were vines full of green leaves hanging down from the tree wall, as if forming a curtain. Behind it was the main hall of the palace. This main hall was also half open. There was a giant crystal above the hall that could filter the light from the outside, allowing sunlight or moonlight to pour on the magic fountain in the center of the hall, allowing the sparkling spring water to gush over the pebbles. When Brando and Amandina walked into the hall, they happened to see the eldest prince of the Cruz people standing by the spring, looking down at the sparkling golden water flow, thinking about something. "Your Highness Leneret, are you satisfied with your stay?" Brando walked to a place not far from him and stopped to greet him. Leneret looked back at them and nodded, but did not answer, only waiting for them to speak. This guy is still as boring as ever, Bu thought. He took the initiative to speak. "Your Highness Leneret, the Wind Elves have started a war in the wilderness of the Four Realms, and the Golden Mane Lion Men are also gathering an army. The Holy War can be said to have begun. I wonder what your Highness thinks about this?" Since the start of the Holy War, the Silver Queen had no choice but to rely heavily on the military nobles in the empire, and most of these nobles supported the eldest son of the emperor. Leneret nodded silently and asked, "According to the usual practice, the Holy Cathedral of Fire should have summoned the envoys of various countries to Rushta. I haven't had the time to congratulate Mr. Count on being appointed as the head of the envoy group. His Highness Lenoret has also lived in Tanajul for some time. He wouldn't not want to return to the Empire, would he? The eldest son of the Cruz people raised his head and looked at him with light blue eyes. That indifferent gaze seemed to say, could it be that you, a little Count of Tanajul, also want to intervene in the battle for the throne of the Empire? Brando spread his hands and smiled slightly. Your Highness, it's not that I want to pull chestnuts out of the fire, but I have no choice. I have no intention of intervening in the internal affairs of the Cruz people, especially the most troublesome battle for the throne. But now that things have come to this, I have to think of a way to protect myself. This matter is good for you and good for me, so I would like to get some advice from you. What advice? Lenoret asked. First of all, I want to know in the Empire who will spare no effort to support you. Lenoret frowned slightly, as if considering the value of this meeting. After a moment of consideration, he gestured to Brando. The gesture meant, please come inside and talk, and then turned and walked in the direction of the study. Brendel seemed to have expected this, and he brought Amandina along to follow them. They went all the way to the study. There were a few light spirits in the study waiting for the eldest son's instructions. Lenoret asked them to set up the room and put black tea and snacks. Although these light spirits also listened to Brando's orders, Brando was good-natured and waited for the eldest son of the Cruz people to exercise his authority, although his authority was also limited to this palace. A moment later, when a few light spirits flew out of the room, the eldest son of the Cruz people solemnly replied, Mr. Count, the Octavier family is my wife's family, and Duke Ludwig will spare no effort to support me. Brando really did not expect the eldest son of the emperor to already have a wife at such a young age. However, this kind of political marriage in Wonde was equivalent to taking sides. The Octavier family could be said to be tied to Lenoret for good or ill, so Duke Ludwig in the Cruz Empire could be regarded as the kind of person that the eldest son of the emperor could completely trust. What else? He continued to ask. The Nona family is my ally. What's going on? Brando asked. Old Marquis Inoan had publicly opposed the succession of the late king to my mother, so he had a grudge with my mother. This kind of hatred will not be resolved with the passage of time, so the most eager to have my mother abdicate is the Nona family. I have a secret agreement with the Nona family, and Marquis Inoan promised to give me a portion of Inoan's mining shares and unreservedly support me in seizing the throne. Lenoret replied calmly. Brando suddenly understood. No wonder Mangrove was in such a hurry to come from the Empire to Tanajul. The Empire's army was divided into 4, and the current Marquis Inoan Mangrove was the commander of the Black Legion. In addition, the Azure Legion was in the hands of the Arahik family behind Veronica. The Nigel family, which was related to the royal family by blood, controlled the White Legion on the border of Hazel, and the Red Legion on the border of St. Tossel. These 3 families were the typical representatives of the military aristocracy in the north. The attitude of these military aristocrats was generally biased towards the eldest son of the emperor's succession, but this only represented one attitude. According to Lenoret's words, the only one who was really willing to contribute should be the Nona family. Brando noted this point and continued to ask, anything else? The old Prime Minister Nydevan. Prime Minister Nydevan. Brando was shocked and asked again almost in disbelief. The old Prime Minister of the Cruz Empire, Nydevan, was not an ordinary person. He should be more than 150 years old now, and was an elder of the Empire for 3 generations. 100 years ago, it was with his help that the Emperor of Cruz regained power from the Holy Cathedral. If there was any legend of the people of Cruz in this era, it should be the Prime Minister. And with his identity and wisdom, or to put it bluntly, such an old fox, how could he easily choose a side? Brando looked at the eldest son of the Cruz Empire suspiciously, and Lenoret replied slowly, Mother's favor to the Pallet family is actually to use the power of the local aristocrats to suppress other forces in the court. The military aristocrats in the north rarely intervene in government affairs, so her purpose is known to the world. Nothing more than the Prime Minister and the Holy Cathedral. The Prime Minister understands that Mother has no good feelings for him, so naturally he will not stand on that side. But he may not stand on your side either. Brando thought to himself that the Empire had plenty of princes and princesses, And it was not to the extent that there would be no heir just because of the loss of the eldest son. However, the eldest son was at least right about one thing, and that was that no matter which prince or princess was chosen to inherit the empire, the old prime minister would not stand on the side of the Silver Queen. That was enough. He silently calculated that the three forces mentioned by Lenorette came from the distant relatives of the royal family, the military aristocrats, and the general aristocrats. The most hardcore of them should be Duke Ludwig of the Octavier family, followed by the Nona family. The old prime minister Nidevan could only be regarded as a potential ally, or rather, an enemy. Brando still remembered that he had offended the daughter of the prime minister of the empire, the precious granddaughter of the old prime minister, so he would try not to provoke her if he could. On the surface, there were several forces in the Cruz Empire: the royal family, the military aristocrats, the local aristocrats, and the Holy Sanctum. These four forces basically controlled most of the empire's land, population, resources, and army. The empire's land, population, and resources were of little significance to Brando. The most important thing for his plan was the army. In the empire's army, the four traditional legions were controlled by the military aristocrats, and the royal family controlled two of them through marriage. The patrolling cavalry and local garrison forces in various areas had always been the traditional sphere of influence of the local aristocrats, including the newly risen navy. However, the local aristocrats were divided into two, with the royal family and the Holy Sanctum each occupying one of them. The royal family was more closely related to the autonomous grand duchies in the north, while the Holy Sanctum mainly influenced the small and large lords in the south. Finally, the Holy Sanctum itself also had a military force that could not be underestimated, including the most elite part of the Cruz army, such as the bishops and the Flame family knights. Brando thought about it, and suddenly realized that he had missed something. What about Veronica? Shouldn't she also support His Royal Highness? He raised his head and asked Lenorette this question somewhat strangely. The eldest prince of the Cruz Empire glanced at him and shook his head. "Mr. Count, the teacher supports me because of the honor and sense of justice of the military, but the Arizic family behind the teacher may not stand on my side." Brando understood what was going on after hearing this, and he could not help but be in awe. The names mentioned by Lenorette before, including the military aristocrats in the north, could at most be called qualified politicians, but this female legion commander was a real soldier and knight of the empire. He tapped his knuckles and began to analyze while replying to Lenorette. "I have probably understood, Your Royal Highness. Let's now determine what our goal is." In Brando's heart, what he most wanted to see was, of course, the prince returning directly to the empire and pulling his supporters to fight against Her Royal Highness. The slightest result of this would be a coup, but the more likely result would be a civil war. Of course, this idea was just a thought. The eldest prince was not a fool, and his supporters had not been affected by the halo of retardation. The ultimate goal of a plan depended on the power they had now. A beggar would not rashly dream of becoming a king. A farmer's long-term plan was mostly to buy a few more acres of land, not to become a wealthy merchant who could traverse the four seas. And the goal Brando set for Lenorette was self-preservation. Self-preservation. The eldest prince of the Cruz people chewed on the word carefully. Self-preservation. First, ensure that my supporters in the empire will not be swept away by my mother. Is that what you mean? Damn, this is a monster. Brando could not help but curse in his heart. Although he had heard about the wisdom and strength of the eldest prince in history, but when he really faced him, he could not help but feel that his IQ was crushed by the other party by several levels. He, Amandina, and Carglass had discussed this plan several times, and finally decided on the details one by one. He did not expect the other party to guess what they meant just by hearing the name. The Silver Queen had set such a grand goal of unifying Wond, and what she had to do was to gather the army first. It was conceivable that she would definitely start with the Nona family first, and she had previously suppressed the northern nobles in preparation for this day. The military nobles were not fools, and naturally understood the principle that if one were to prosper, all would prosper, and if one were to suffer, all would suffer. The only way Her Majesty could deal with them was to use the peaceful period to reduce the army and the power in the hands of these nobles. But the early arrival of the Holy War forced the Silver Queen to let go of the restraints on the northern nobles, because she knew very well that she still had many opponents in the empire. If she lost in the holy war, then these opponents hiding in the dark would jump out together to force her to abdicate. She had been in the empire for 40 years, and according to the previous agreement, she should have abdicated long ago. If she wanted to continue to rule this huge empire, she had to increase her prestige and give herself a legitimate reason not to leave. The best reason was that she could lead the people of Cruz to victory. And this was the opportunity for Brando and the eldest son of the emperor. But at this time, not only could they not stand up against the Supreme One, but they also had to restrain themselves and try not to give her a chance to make mistakes. On the surface, the only army that Lenoret could control was the Black Legion, plus the local noble forces that Duke Duguay could influence in the north. But in fact, the Silver Queen could not control too many troops, only the Red and White Legions. But compared to the eldest son of the emperor, she had more potential enemies. She was on bad terms with the Kirk family, the Holy Cathedral, and the Prime Minister. The Arazico family was said to be very close to the Flower Leaf territory, so they would not be determined to support Her Majesty. On the contrary, although they were not loyal allies of the eldest son of the emperor, there was no shortage of opportunities to turn enemies into friends, because at least they had a common enemy. Brando's proposal to Lenoret was to first secretly connect his forces in the country in his name to help each other, and then hide deep in the dark. This was a means of self-protection. Self-protection itself was a kind of defense, but defense was also for counterattack. This holy war was an indescribable whirlpool for the Cruz Empire. The Holy Cathedral wanted to win, and the Silver Queen also wanted to win, but the Holy Cathedral was not willing to make a wedding dress for the Silver Queen, and presumably the Supreme One of the Empire had the same idea. And the local nobles also had their own ulterior motives. There were hardcore supporters of the Queen, and there were also supporters of the Holy Cathedral. When the two sides wrestled with each other, the power owned by the eldest son of the emperor became a decisive force. If he chose to remain silent, then the Silver Queen's plan to integrate the power of the empire to achieve military victory in the Holy War could be said to have failed by half. In the face of this situation, it was not surprising that the old Prime Minister Naidivan would look on coldly, and the attitude of the local nobles would change over time, because of a very simple principle. A newly ascended emperor and an iron-blooded queen who had ruled the empire for 40 years had a completely different power in terms of governing ability. No local nobles would like an overly powerful emperor. This was a universal truth in Wonde, so it was self-evident who they would eventually side with. When the prestige of Her Majesty the Queen weakened day by day with the deepening of the war, then the voices forcing her to abdicate would one day reach a consensus among all the nobles. At that time, Lenoret could justifiably return to the empire and receive the support of the nobles. This was the final counterattack. Of course, self-protection at this stage was also good for Brando. He wanted to go to the empire to take back the Azure Lance and Scarlet, and it was conceivable that his enemy should be Her Majesty the Queen and the Holy Cathedral of Fire. Therefore, the last thing he wanted to see was a completely unified empire, whether under the name of the Silver Queen or the Holy Cathedral. Therefore, what he had to do was to maintain the chaotic status quo of the empire and seek opportunities for himself with the help of the opposition from many sides. At the same time, Lenoret's allies in the north could also provide him with the necessary protection, such as arranging a safe channel for him to escape the empire. In this regard, he and the eldest son of the Kurlutzians had common interests. Lenoret listened carefully to Amandina's analysis and nodded silently. He finally looked at Brando, and his gaze was no longer so cold. He thought for a moment before he replied, "Count, thank you for your frank proposal. I think I can trust you completely. If one day I ascend the throne, then your friendship with me today will become a precious witness." Brando smiled slightly and finally breathed a sigh of relief in his heart. "Then it's a pleasure to work with you, Your Highness," he replied. Lenoret nodded slightly to him as a sign of acknowledgement, but his stern face did not loosen in the slightest. He thought for a moment and suddenly said, "As a friend, I have some personal advice that I can tell you, Count." Brando was slightly taken aback and asked, "What advice?" "I know my mother's character and conduct very well. Your subordinate is in her hands, and she will definitely use you and Erwin to coerce her into submission. I think, Count, if your subordinate's inner world is not very indestructible, you'd better do something to give her some confidence." The eldest prince replied faintly. Sure enough, His Royal Highness already knew the real reason why he came here. Brando thought in his heart, but he immediately realized that the information provided by Prince Lenoret was very deceptive. He thought for a moment and felt that with Her Majesty's character of not giving up until she achieved her goal, she would most likely do so. Thinking of this, he suddenly felt that his trip was not a loss. He hurriedly nodded to the eldest prince of the cruise people. I understand what to do, thank you very much. Correction, yesterday's scene 55 should be scene 56. Today, I will release the first chapter, scene 57, and there will be another one later. I hope everyone will enjoy it, and I also hope everyone will support me and spend more monthly votes. Chapter 901. It was the last few days of the month of frost, and the weather outside was so cold that it made one's teeth chatter. The deciduous forests around Maxen and Schaflund couldn't escape the bleak scene. The trees were starting to become bare, and a thick layer of withered leaves had fallen on the ground since late autumn. It was as if a gray carpet had been laid out in layers between the trees. There were even a few light snowfalls in the northern regions. Although it wasn't to the extent of being covered in snow, it was at least an omen of winter in the year of the sword. This was the worst month of the year to start a war, but the Holy War just had to start at this time. History was always so unreasonable, and sometimes it was even more whimsical than the stories described. In Abies, only the black pine forest outside the Baron's castle was still tall and green in the midst of the solemn atmosphere of war. However, there was a faint black color between the canopy of the trees, as if the entire shade of the trees was a ghost hovering overhead. When the cold wind whistled past the tips of the pine trees, it made a strange whistling sound that made one's hair stand on end. Translator. Endless Fantasy Translation Editor. Endless Fantasy Translation. The guests of Trentheim were stomping their feet and rubbing their hands as they complained about the horrible weather. Most of them were dressed in bright clothes and had the air of a big city. They didn't look like locals at all. A dozen or so carriages were parked outside the courtyard, their bodies painted with all kinds of emblems. Each one represented the glorious history of a family. These nobles came from all over the Erewhon, and most of them were here for the first time in Tonajol. They were here for only one purpose: to go on a diplomatic mission to the Cruz Empire. It was also a rare time for Abies Castle to be lively, although it didn't matter if the owner was willing to receive these guests. Although the diplomatic mission to the Cruz Empire was nominally headed by Brando, and he could choose any members to accompany him, an ancient tradition dictated that there must be a fixed number of seats in the diplomatic mission, and these seats were what Brando couldn't designate. Among them, there was a representative of the royal family, and Prince Haruz would represent the House of Corvado. In addition, he could also choose 2 maids, an attendant, and an accompanying knight. The original list included Madame Windsor and Madame Sigma, the 2 nannies of His Royal Highness when he was in Winterclaw Castle. However, Haruz asked Brando to replace Madame Windsor with Medusa Lysimeka at the last minute, which made Brando wonder if the prince had reached the age of love. As for his attendant, he was a young man from Corvado, whom Brando had never heard of before. He must be a member of the royal family, and the accompanying knight was naturally the most trusted candidate of Her Royal Highness Maynard. In addition to the Corvado royal family, according to the agreement of the Holy Cathedral, Erewhon's former royal family, the Cipher royal family, should also send a representative. However, this representative naturally couldn't travel thousands of miles across Ampere-Seal for a week or 2 to meet them here. Her Royal Highness's brother had already sent a letter to tell them that he had chosen the candidate, and that the envoy and his entourage would meet them in Grey Mountain, so his sister and the count didn't have to worry too much. Then for dukes, Viro, Grinoires, Lantanailan, Karsuk and 3 counts, Count Janalassu, Count Yenbao and Count Grey Mountain, plus a Marquis of Balta, each with a representative. There were originally supposed to be representatives of Erech and Radnor, but now these 2 territories had been removed, and they were both part of the royal family's territory and part of Tonajol. Erech's family was few in number, and after the Battle of Ampere-Seal, they were basically wiped out. Count Radnor and his family were still in prison in Magiton, so naturally, it was impossible for them to send any representatives. Among the 4 dukes, Duke Viro directly sent his youngest daughter. Duke Talanalan's envoy, Duke Eek, and Duke Karsuk sent a meatball, who was said to be his second son. As for Duke Grinoires, he also sent a daughter, but she was only a little girl of 7 or 8 years old. Count Janilasu was a believer of the Silver Lion Association. He did not have a wife, so naturally, he did not have any children. He sent a sergeant whom he thought highly of, a very energetic young man. The envoy of the Count of Grey Mountain also did not come to Tanajul, so naturally, he was waiting with the envoy of Cipher to meet them in Grey Mountain. In the end, there was a little twist in the choice of Count Yenbao's envoy, because there was no news of Count Yenbao for a long time. In the middle of the month of frost, Baron Dahl sent an envoy himself, but he was directly driven away by the angry princess. In the end, Dilfrey decided to personally serve as Yenbao's envoy. First, she could leave an impression on the Holy Cathedral of Fire as the future successor of Yenbao, and second, she could thwart Baron Dahl's conspiracy. Brando considered her physical condition, and specially prepared a larger carriage for her. Most of these nobles had their own attendants, ranging from 1 to 3. Thus, when added together, it was a bloated group of 20 or so people and 5 or 6 carriages. However, if one thought that this group was large enough, then one would be gravely mistaken. Brando soon found that there were some unexpected guests in this team. One of them was Princess Magadol. As the Princess of Antiburo, she naturally had to represent her duchy to Cruz. Originally, the Empire thought that she had died in the war in Ampere Seal, so the order was also passed to the duchy, hoping that the duchy could send another envoy to Cruz. But this news somehow reached the ears of the nun princess, and after she heard the news, she insisted on being the envoy of Antiburo to the Empire. She also privately communicated with the Antiburo royal family, so Brando naturally could not stop her. After all, the princess was recuperating in Tanajul and was not under house arrest, so he had no reason to restrict her freedom to contact the outside world. And another uninvited guest was now in front of Brando. At this moment, Brando was staring at the merchant lady in front of him. She was wearing a thick fur coat, boots, gloves, a scarf, and a bearskin hat. Her small face was almost only revealing a pair of black eyes. He looked at the large suitcase in her small hands and finally couldn't help but ask, "Well, now can you tell me, what are you planning to do here?" "Go to the Empire with Brando. I haven't been there yet." The little Roman raised her chin, revealing her small mouth from under the scarf, and answered matter-of-factly. Brando rolled his eyes. "Of course I know that, but I already said that there are no more places for the diplomatic group. Besides, you don't seem to remember. I told you to stay in Tanajul obediently and leave yourself in a safer place. Don't make me worry, do you understand?" He couldn't help but facepalm. This girl clearly promised him yesterday that there were no more places for the diplomatic group, and told him to stay in the territory obediently and support Amandina. She clearly promised that she would never take up a place in the diplomatic group. Wait, Brando suddenly froze in place. He reacted and glared at the young lady. "Oh damn it, you're playing word games with me again." "No." Little Roman blew a puff of white air on his hand and replied with a smile, "I'm the rightful one." "Justified, my ass." Brando pinched her face. "Listen to me obediently, stay in Tanajul, you're not allowed to go anywhere." Brendel pinched Romaine's cheeks for a long time, but she kept waving her hands trying to break free from his grip, but her mouth did not loosen. He could not help but become a little suspicious. This was not in line with her temperament. He could not help but let go of his hand and ask doubtfully, "All right, tell me, what exactly are you going to do in the Empire?" The little Roman rubbed her red cheeks and showed a fierce look. "I've been invited by the Holy Cathedral of Fire, as the president of the Seven Seas Merchant Guild, and as a distinguished guest of the Holy Cathedral of Fire, I'm going to the Cruz Empire to participate in the ceremony of the Holy War." She deliberately emphasized the word distinguished guest, and then handed the invitation to Brando. Brando opened the parchment letter and almost blacked out and fell to the ground. It was true that the Holy Cathedral of Fire would invite some famous businessmen, poets, and even artists and scholars from various fields to participate in the annual large-scale celebrations or ceremonies of the opening of the Holy War. But he never dreamed that Roman, his somewhat muddle-headed and unreliable fiancé, would be on the list. He couldn't help but read the letter over and over again several times, and finally confirmed that the magic wax seal on the letter was the real emblem of the Holy Cathedral. After confirming that there was no mistake, he had to admit that this thing did not look fake. He raised his head and looked at the Roman as if he was looking at an alien. When did your business become so big? Very long ago. The Holy Cathedral of Fire invited me to the Harvest Festival this year, but at that time they were going to Ampere Seal. I've already been there, so I don't want to go anymore. It's not fun at all. The little Roman replied casually, as if the invitation from the Holy Cathedral of Fire was just an invitation for her to go on a trip, and whether she would go or not depended on her mood. Brando almost knelt down to her. The Holy Cathedral of Fire's tradition of inviting celebrities had always existed in the game. At that time, there were some famous merchant guilds among the players in Erewhon. Until the Second Era, these merchant guilds with major sponsors behind them would often break their heads over such an invitation letter. There were even a few instances where it almost led to a war between the merchant guilds. At least Brando had seen it happen a few times. Brando carefully looked at his almighty fiancée, and felt that there must be something like Martha's daughter behind this. But in the end, it was Amandina who cleared his doubts. It turned out that many of the resources produced in the Black Forest, including some precious magic materials and magic crystals, were strategic resources that the Holy Cathedral of Fire urgently needed, especially during the period before the start of the Holy War. Tanagel's large exports in the past year had long made it an important partner in the eyes of the Holy Cathedral of Fire, so it was not surprising that the Roman, the nominal president of the Seven Seas Merchant Guild, was valued by the Holy Cathedral. But Brando shook his head, still thinking that Amandina had used a cheat. One must know that to become a merchant that could trade with the Holy Cathedral of Fire, it was not only enough to have a supply of goods, but also required a considerable network of contacts. He did not have to think to guess that the Roman must have used the connections of the merchant guilds in Ampere Seal. But as for how she did it, it was a bit ridiculous. Because this could only be explained by a miracle in Amandina's opinion. Can I go now, Brando? The little Roman covered her face and asked pitifully, but there was clearly a little pride in her voice. Up to you, Brando replied in a bad mood. He felt that in front of this little fiancé of his intelligence and sense of existence as a count had been severely devalued, and this made him feel very hurt. Then Brando, help me prepare a carriage. I want the one I usually use, with a stove that can put charcoal on it. No, go to my carriage obediently. Oh. After sending away the Roman lady and the second son of Duke Karsuk, who was almost the same height and width, who had been trying to get close to him, Brando finally broke away from the group of young masters and ladies. He walked to the side of the carriage and just happened to see Ferlin coming out of the castle with a notebook in her hand. When he saw the elder of the Wild Elf sisters, he knew that the things she had prepared were probably done, and hurriedly greeted her. Ferlin! My lord! Are Brunhilde and the others ready? The elder of the Wild Elf sisters nodded. Very good. Brendel finally let out a sigh of relief in his heart. This trip was not really to bring these young ladies and young masters out for a vacation, it was just a pretense on the surface. Moreover, Princess Grafine had appointed him as the leader of the envoy group, and even appointed him as the commander of the Southern Legion. This appointment had arrived earlier, and it was obvious that she wanted him to transfer the elites from Tanagel to form the accompanying guards for this envoy group. This was a tradition that had been tacitly agreed upon. Before the start of the Holy War, the Empire had summoned the envoys of the various kingdoms and duchies, and this had become a tradition since the First Holy War. Today, this was not only a way for the Holy Cathedral of Fire to confirm the confidence of the participants, but also a way for the vassal states to compete with each other to obtain a higher status in the Holy Cathedral of Fire. In this envoy group, first of all, the noble families had to greet the representatives of the empire. This in itself represented a respectful submission, and was also a way for the vassal states to pledge their allegiance to the Holy Cathedral. Of course, this kind of greeting was not so blatant, and appeared to be a little more reserved. On the other hand, there was the accompanying guards of the envoy group. After all, the Holy War was a war, and every country needed to show their strength to the Holy Cathedral of Fire to obtain a corresponding status in the war, and even after. The guards of this envoy group were a means of showing off. Generally speaking, the guards of the envoy group were the most elite forces of each country, representing the highest standard of the duchies and kingdoms, and also the face of the nobles and the royal family. In order to maintain this face and glory, the guards of these envoys would even compete with each other in the Cruz Empire and clash with each other. Of course, this kind of conflict rarely resulted in bloodshed, but the side that lost face most of the time would not have a good time after returning to their country. The strongest group of guards of the envoy group in all the previous holy wars should be the guards of the Black Raven Duchy in the west of the empire. This duchy was adjacent to the Hazel people and the Holy Cathedral of Earth. Although the duchy accepted the faith of the Holy Cathedral of Fire, most of the inhabitants were half-orcs and half-beastmen, and the people were very valiant, and the nobles were also very martial. At that time they sent a guard composed of bear warriors, and whether it was in terms of quantity or quality, they crushed the guards of the other countries. Unfortunately, they met the Erowin people of that era. In that holy war, the envoy group sent by the Erowin people could be said to be the most shabby one in all the previous holy wars. Other than the nobles' representatives, the envoy group was made up of officers of the White Lion Legion, and there were less than 20 people in total. However, the problem was that the captain of this group of 20 people was the Earth Sword Saint Darius, and the vice-captain was the scholar of the Mithril Fortress, Tulman. With just these two people they swept away everyone including Cruz's people. As for how Brando's famous grandfather later became the marshal of the Allied forces, that was another story. The envoy group was the face of Erowin, and Tanajul was now the strongest territory in the entire Erowin Empire. Therefore, when the princess chose Brando to be the leader of the envoy group, although the royal faction had objections, they did not dare to oppose too much. As for Brando and Her Royal Highness, the two of them had reached a tacit understanding, and they used this as an excuse to brazenly stuff people into this so-called guard group. As for why these people would go to Cruz in the end, that was hard to say. Brando took the notebook from Falern's hand and casually flipped through it, then looked up at the entire convoy and said softly, "Then let's go, we'll see you in Cruz." At the end he added in a low voice, "Holy War! Holy War, here I come. I hope that everyone can spend as much as they can on the monthly votes as they can, so that they can get the inspiration and motivation to write." Chapter 902. It was the last few days of the month of frost, and the weather outside was so cold that it made one's teeth chatter. The deciduous forests around Maxen and Schaflun couldn't escape the bleak scene. The trees were starting to become bare, and a thick layer of withered leaves had fallen on the ground since late autumn. It was as if a gray carpet had been laid out in layers between the trees. There were even a few light snowfalls in the northern regions. Although it wasn't to the extent of being covered in snow, it was at least an omen of winter in the year of the sword. This was the worst month of the year to start a war, but the Holy War just had to start at this time. History was always so unreasonable, and sometimes it was even more whimsical than the stories described. In Abes, only the black pine forest outside the Baron's castle was still tall and green in the midst of the solemn atmosphere of war. However, there was a faint black color between the canopy of the trees, as if the entire shade of the trees was a ghost hovering overhead. When the cold wind whistled past the tips of the pine trees, it made a strange whistling sound that made one's hair stand on end. Translator. Endless Fantasy Translation Editor. Endless Fantasy Translation. The guests of Trentheim were stomping their feet and rubbing their hands as they complained about the horrible weather. Most of them were dressed in bright clothes and had the air of a big city. They didn't look like locals at all. A dozen or so carriages were parked outside the courtyard, their bodies painted with all kinds of emblems. Each one represented the glorious history of a family. These nobles came from all over the Erowin, and most of them were here for the first time in Tanajul. They were here for only one purpose: to go on a diplomatic mission to the Cruz Empire. It was also a rare time for Abes Castle to be lively, although it didn't matter if the owner was willing to receive these guests. Although Brando was nominally the head of the diplomatic mission to the Cruz Empire, and he could choose any members to accompany him, an ancient tradition dictated that there must be some fixed seats in the diplomatic mission, and these seats were those that Brando couldn't specify. Among them, there was one representative of the royal family, and Prince Haruz would represent the House of Corvado. In addition, he could also choose 2 maids, an attendant, and an accompanying knight. The original list included Madame Windsor and Madame Sigma, the 2 wet nurses of His Royal Highness when he was in Winterclaw Castle. However, Haruz asked Brando to replace Madame Windsor with Medusa Lysimeka at the last minute, which made Brando wonder if the prince had reached the age of love. As for his attendant, he was a young man from Corvado, whom Brando had never heard of before. He must be a member of the royal family, and the accompanying knight was naturally the most trusted candidate of Her Royal Highness Maynard. In addition to the Corvado royal family, according to the agreement of the Holy Cathedral, the former royal family of Erewhon, the Cipher royal family should also send a representative. However, this representative naturally couldn't travel thousands of miles across Ampere-Seal for a week or two to meet them here. The princess brother had already sent a letter to tell them that he had chosen a candidate. The envoy and his entourage would meet them in Grey Mountain, so his sister and the count didn't have to worry too much. Then came the 4 dukes, Viro, Grinoires, Lantanilin and Karsuk, and the 3 counts, Janilasup, Yenbao and Greymont with the Marquis of Balta, each with a representative. Originally, there should have been a representative of Erech and Radnor, but now these 2 territories had been removed and became part of the royal family's territory in Tonajol. The Erech family was few in number, and after the Battle of Ampere-Seal, they were basically wiped out. Count Radnor and his family were still eating prison food in Magitan's dungeon, so it was naturally impossible for them to send a representative. Among the 4 dukes, Duke Viro directly sent his youngest daughter, Duke Talanalin's envoy, Duke Eek, and Duke Karsuk sent a meatball, who was said to be his second son. As for Duke Grinoires, he also sent a daughter, but she was only a little girl of 7 or 8 years old. Count Janilasu was a believer of the Silver Lion Association. He did not have a wife, so naturally, he did not have any children. He sent a sergeant whom he thought highly of, a very energetic young man. The envoy of the Grey Mountain did not come to Tonajol either, so naturally, he was waiting with the envoy of Cipher to meet them in Grey Mountain. In the end, there was a small twist in the choice of Count Yenbao's envoy, because there was no news of Count Yenbao for a long time. In the middle of the month of frost, Baron Dahl sent an envoy himself, but he was directly driven away by the angry princess. In the end, Dilfrey decided to personally serve as Yenbao's envoy. Firstly, she could leave an impression on the future successor of Yenbao in the Holy Cathedral of Fire, and secondly, she could thwart Baron Dahl's conspiracy. Brando considered her physical condition, and specially prepared a larger carriage for her. Most of these nobles had their own attendants, ranging from 1 to 3. Thus, when added together, it was a bloated group of 20 or so people and 5 or 6 carriages. However, if one thought that this group was large enough, then one would be gravely mistaken. Brando soon found that there were some unexpected guests in this team. One of them was Princess Magadol. As the Princess of Antiburo, she naturally had to represent her duchy to cruise. Originally, the Empire thought that she had died in the war in Ampere-Seal, so the order was also passed to the duchy, hoping that the duchy could send another envoy to cruise. But this news somehow reached the ears of the nun princess, and after she heard the news, she insisted on being the envoy of Antiburo to the Empire. She also privately communicated with the Antiburo royal family, so Brando naturally could not stop her. After all, the princess was recuperating in Tonajol, not under house arrest, so he had no reason to restrict her freedom to contact the outside world. And another uninvited guest was now in front of Brando. At this moment, Brando was staring at the merchant lady in front of him, who was wearing a thick fur coat, boots, gloves, a scarf and a bearskin hat. Her small face was almost only revealing a pair of black eyes. He looked at the large suitcase in her small hands, and finally couldn't help but ask, "Well, now can you tell me, what are you planning to do here?" "Go to the Empire with Brando. I haven't been there yet." The little Roman raised her chin, revealing her small mouth from under the scarf, and answered matter-of-factly. Brando rolled his eyes. "Of course I know that, but I already said that there are no more places for the diplomatic group. Also, you don't seem to remember, I told you to stay in Tonajol obediently, and leave yourself in a safer place. Don't make me worry, understand?" He couldn't help but facepalm. This girl clearly promised him yesterday that there were no more places for the diplomatic group, and told him to stay in the territory obediently and support Amandina. She clearly promised that she would never take up a place in the diplomatic group. "Wait," Brando suddenly froze in place, then reacted and glared at the young lady. "Oh damn it, you're playing word games with me again." "Nope." The little Roman blew a white breath on her hand, and answered with a smile, "I'm perfectly justified." "Justified, my ass?" Brando pinched her face. "Listen to me obediently, stay in Tonajal, you're not allowed to go anywhere." Brando pinched the merchant girl's face for a while, but seeing her waving her hands and trying to break free from his hand, he couldn't help but feel a little suspicious. This was not in line with the young lady's temperament. He couldn't help but let go and asked doubtfully, "All right, tell me, why are you going to the Empire?" The little Roman rubbed her red cheeks and showed a fierce look. "I've been invited by the Holy Cathedral of Fire, as the president of the Seven Seas Merchant Guild, and as a distinguished guest of the Holy Cathedral of Fire, I'm going to the Cruz Empire to participate in the ceremony of the Holy War." She deliberately emphasized the word distinguished guest, and then handed the invitation to Brando. Brando opened the parchment letter, and almost blacked out and fell to the ground. The Holy Cathedral of Fire did invite some famous businessmen, poets, and even artists and scholars of various fields to participate in the annual large-scale celebration, or in commemoration of the opening of the Holy War, but he never dreamed that the Roman would be on the list, his somewhat muddle-headed and unreliable fiancée. He couldn't help but read the letter several times, and finally confirmed that the magic wax seal on the letter was the real emblem of the Holy Cathedral. After confirming that there was no mistake, he had to admit that this thing didn't look fake. He raised his head and looked at the Roman as if he was looking at an alien. "When did your business become so big?" "Very long ago. The Holy Cathedral of Fire invited me to the Harvest Festival this year, but at that time they were going to Ampere Seal. I've already been there, so I don't want to go anymore. It's not fun at all." The little Roman replied casually, as if the invitation from the Holy Cathedral of Fire was just an invitation for her to go on a trip, and whether she would go or not depended on her mood. Brando almost knelt down to her. The Holy Cathedral of Fire's tradition of inviting celebrities had always existed in the game. At that time, there were some famous merchant guilds among the players in Erewhon. Until the Second Era, these merchant guilds with major sponsors behind them would often break their heads over such an invitation letter. There were even a few instances where it almost led to a war between the merchant guilds. At least Brando had seen it happen a few times. Brando carefully looked at his almighty fiancée, and felt that there must be something like Martha's daughter behind this. But in the end, it was Amandina who cleared his doubts. It turned out that many of the resources produced in the Black Forest, including some precious magic materials and magic crystals, were strategic resources that the Holy Cathedral of Fire urgently needed, especially during the period before the start of the Holy War. Tonajal's large exports in the past year had long made it an important partner in the eyes of the Holy Cathedral of Fire, so it was not surprising that the Roman, the nominal president of the Seven Seas Merchant Guild, was valued by the Holy Cathedral. But Brando shook his head, still thinking that Amandina had used to cheat. One must know that to become a merchant that could trade with the Holy Cathedral of Fire, it was not only enough to have a supply of goods, but also required a considerable network of contacts. He did not have to think to guess that the Roman must have used the connections of the merchant guilds in Ampere Seal. But as for how she did it, it was a bit ridiculous. Because this could only be explained by a miracle in Amandina's opinion. "Can I go now, Brando?" The little Roman covered her face and asked pitifully, but there was clearly a little pride in her voice. "Up to you." Brando replied in a bad mood. He felt that in front of this little fiancé, his intelligence and sense of existence as a count had been severely devalued, and this made him feel very hurt. "Then Brando, help me prepare a carriage. I want the one I usually use, and there's a stove on it that can put charcoal." "No, go to my carriage obediently." "Oh." After sending away the Roman lady and the second son of Duke Karsuk, who was almost the same height and width, who had been trying to get close to him, Brando finally broke away from the group of young masters and ladies. He walked to the side of the carriage and just happened to see Ferlin coming out of the castle with a notebook in her hand. He saw the elder of the wild elf sisters and knew that the things she had prepared were probably done. He hurriedly greeted her. "Ferlin, my lord. Are Brunhilde and the others ready?" The elder of the wild elf sisters nodded. "Very good." Brendel finally let out a sigh of relief in his heart. This trip was not really to bring these young ladies and young masters out for a vacation, it was just a pretense on the surface. Moreover, Princess Grafine had appointed him as the leader of the envoy group and the commander of the Southern Legion. This appointment had arrived earlier, and it was obvious that she wanted him to transfer the elites from Tanajil to form the accompanying guards for this envoy group. This was a tradition that had been tacitly agreed upon. Before the start of the Holy War, the empire had summoned the envoys of the various kingdoms and duchies. This had become a tradition since the First Holy War. Today, this was not only a way for the Holy Cathedral of Fire to confirm the confidence of the participants, but also a way for the vassal states to compete with each other to obtain a higher status in the Holy Cathedral of Fire. In this envoy group, first of all, the noble families had to greet the representatives of the empire. This in itself represented a kind of respectful submission, and was also a way for the vassal states to pledge their loyalty to the Holy Cathedral. Of course, this kind of greeting was not so blatant and was a little more reserved. On the other hand, there was the accompanying guards of the envoy group. After all, the Holy War was a war, and every country needed to show their strength to the Holy Cathedral of Fire to obtain a corresponding status in the war and even after. The guards of the envoy group were a means of showing off. Generally speaking, the guards of the envoy group were the most elite forces of each country, representing the highest standard of the duchies and kingdoms, and also the face of the nobles and the royal family. In order to maintain this face and glory, these guards of the envoy group would even compete with each other in the Cruz Empire and clash with each other. Of course, this kind of conflict rarely led to bloodshed, but the side that lost face most of the time would not have a good time after returning to their country. The most powerful guard group of the envoy group in all the previous holy wars should be from the Black Raven Duchy in the west of the empire. This duchy was adjacent to the Hazel people and the Holy Cathedral of Earth. Although the duchy accepted the faith of the Holy Cathedral of Fire, most of the inhabitants were half-orcs and half-beastmen, and the people were very valiant, and the nobles were also very martial. At that time they sent out a guard group composed of bear warriors, and whether it was in terms of quantity or quality, they crushed the guards of the other countries. Unfortunately, they met the Erowin people of that era. In that holy war, the envoy group sent out by the Erowin people could be regarded as the most shabby one in all the previous holy wars. Other than the nobles' representatives, the envoy group was made up of the officers of the White Lion Legion, and there were less than 20 people in total. However, the problem was that the captain of this group of 20 people was the Earth Sword Saint Darius, and the vice-captain was the scholar of the Mithril Fortress, Tulman. These two people swept away everyone, including the people of Cruz. As for how Brando's famous grandfather later became the marshal of the Allied forces, that was another story. The envoy group was the face of Erowin, and Tanajil was now the strongest territory in the entire Erowin Empire. Therefore, when the princess chose Brando as the leader of the envoy group, although the royal faction had objections, they did not dare to oppose too much. As for Brando and Her Royal Highness, the two of them had reached a tacit understanding, and they used this as an excuse to brazenly stuff people into this so-called guard group. As for what these people would do in Cruz in the end, that was hard to say. Brando took the notebook from Falern's hand, and casually flipped through it, then looked up at the entire convoy and said softly, "Then let's go, we'll see you in Cruz." Finally, he added in a low voice, "Holy War. Holy War, here I come. P.S. You promised to be the second update, and by the way, ask for next month's monthly votes, students. Also, vote for Blackie and help him keep the 6th place in the classification." Chapter 904. When Brando first set foot on the land of the Grey Mountains, he had a very real feeling in his heart. Wyanmir was lit. The mountains were like fangs piercing into the sky. The mountain people used their language to describe the mountains in the north, and it was undoubtedly the most exquisite rhetoric for the steep and sharp peaks with grey limestone cliffs. The curved and undulating mountain ridges made the distant horizon look equally twisted. Above them was the light grey sky, and below them was the vast and endless valley. The sun poured down on the cliffs on the other side of the valley, and similarly carved the shadow of the mountain they were on. Far away in the mountain stream, some unknown bird of prey was circling, occasionally letting out a sharp howl that echoed between the mountains. The young prince whispered to them that it was a grey falcon, a bird of prey that only lived in the Grey Mountains. Only then did Brando remember that this place was very close to Haru's hometown. If one could look past the vast mountains, one would be able to see the lowlands where the people of Beale had lived for generations, and the vast plains to the north. On the plains there were scattered hills and black pine forests, and there was also a huge capital. He asked the young prince if he had chosen this path when he escaped, and the young prince said yes. But at that time, they left in a carriage under the cover of night. Entering the gray mountains in the dark of night, he felt uneasy. The pitch-black mountains were like sleeping beasts, and it left a deep impression on him. But now that he was with his teacher, he naturally did not have to be afraid anymore. The young prince's words made everyone laugh. In addition to Brando and the Roman, there was also Magadal, Dilfrey, and Maynard. The nun princess and the countess were the original owners of this carriage, while the merchant lady and the young prince squeezed in. It was not that the young lady did not have her own carriage, but Dilfrey's carriage had a special charcoal brazier, so the sneaky young lady thought of this from the beginning and tried to coax the soft-hearted countess to invite them into the carriage. Fortunately, the countess did not mind at all. She was more than happy to have a few more people to chat with. The young Roman chattered and had endless stories, most of which were made up, which was to Dilfrey's liking. Thus, the two of them became good friends in no time. Only Princess Magadal stood by the side and listened with a slight smile, as if she had no intention of getting involved in the conversation. She only spoke occasionally when asked, but every word she said was meaningful, showing the demeanor of the nun princess of the Holy Cathedral of Fire. The carriage rolled on for a while, and there was a knock on the carriage door. Brando opened the door, and a gust of cold wind blew in from the outside, causing the temperature in the carriage to drop by a few degrees. Of course, Maynard was an exception. The female knight sat beside Haruz with her hands on the brass hilt of her sword, her long eyelashes drooping as she counted the tassels on the carriage's curtain. Yuta's weathered face appeared outside the carriage door. The former female mercenary leader and current captain of the White Lion Guards was sitting on horseback, parallel to the carriage. When she saw Brando open the door, she bowed slightly and said to him, "My lord, Fort Tisco is in front. So we've already arrived." Brando asked the carriage to slow down, then jumped off and closed the door. As soon as he set foot on the land of the Grey Mountain, he suddenly felt a sense of reality. This was the first time since he came to this world that he had crossed Ampere Seal and come to the land of the north. He seemed to remember the scene of running and fighting with everyone on this land. He couldn't help but subconsciously look back at the carriage, but through the foggy window he couldn't see the expression on the face behind the window. At this time, the female mercenary leader had already brought him a warhorse from behind. He silently took the reins from Yuta's hand, flipped onto the horse and then asked casually, "How is it? Are you used to the land of the north?" Yuta was a little surprised by the way her lord spoke like a master. She wiped the frost on her eyebrows, shook her head and said with a somewhat amused tone, "My lord, I'm more familiar with this land than you are." Brando was slightly stunned and looked back at his subordinate, as if he just remembered that he had never asked about their origins. "You're from the Grey Mountain? You can say that. Before my sister's accident, we lived in Corvado for a period of time. That experience made me hate the nobles to the core. Sometimes I think that if only I woke up earlier. But forget it, I don't want to talk about these things anymore." Yuta suddenly sighed, looking at the undulating mountains with waning interest. Brando nodded and did not ask any more questions. Yuta was the leader of his guards, but she was not the best choice. The most suitable person was actually Koden, but the old man was determined not to interfere in Tanajal's affairs anymore. After Count Ranner was imprisoned, he bought a piece of land near Menta, as if he was determined to be a carefree manor owner or an old farmer. However, Koden still recommended Yuta to him. Out of the 5 mercenary leaders under him, Reto deliberately distanced himself from the core of power in Abes, and only wanted the refugees from Fortress Reden to live a better life. Kargleis and the others privately called him the leader of the refugees, and the Red-Beard Badam was infatuated with local law and order, as if he was satisfied with just being a magistrate. He once admitted that he did not have any great ambitions, and his current life was already his goal. Brando did not intend to force these 2 mercenary leaders to follow him since the beginning. Besides, he knew that Badam's abilities were limited, and being a magistrate was already the best he could do. The other 3 mercenary leaders who joined later were even more ambitious. Cornelius became Amandina's subordinate, and was responsible for the logistics of the territory's army. Rabin had already made a name for himself in the White Lion Guards, and his military experience in the Karsuk Highlands made him the most comfortable in Brando's army. After the Autumn Twilight War, he became another important assistant to Karglais. Karglais intended to let him command a cavalry unit, but the unit had not been formed yet. Only Yuta's vision seemed to be limited by her experience as a mercenary leader. She was considered outstanding when she was a mercenary leader, but after joining the White Lion Guards, her performance was very ordinary. Amandina appreciated the experience and loyalty of these mercenary leaders, and wanted to give them a better position. Rabin and Cornelius were able to accept it, but Yuta's position was awkward. She did not want to rely on her relationship with Amandina to climb up the ranks, so she was only a small infantry leader in the White Lion Guards. When he received the mission and wanted to find a commander who was capable of commanding a small group, Janna immediately entered his sights. Koden had also suggested that Janna's experience would be extremely useful in commanding a mercenary group that was made up of multiple professions and different types of soldiers. Of course, he actually had a better choice, and that was Freya. However, it was a waste of talent to let Freya be the leader of the diplomatic group. More importantly, she had just gained some reputation in the kingdom, and now she needed to stay and strengthen her position in the Southern Army. On the other hand, he and Maynard were going to the Empire, and the princess needed a loyal general by her side. Freya stayed in Erewhon to partner with Amandina, Karglais, and Cohen, who was far away in Silman, so he could be more assured of the situation in the south. Even if the old nobles wanted to use this opportunity to stir up trouble, the princess and Tanajil would not be in immediate danger. Furthermore, he left behind the Tree Elves and the White Lion Guards, so that Freya would have enough military power to use. Because of this consideration, he finally chose Yuta, and was very satisfied with her performance. In this diplomatic group, he brought along Medisha, the Shire, Hipamra, the Nightsong Tigers mercenary group, the White Lion Guards that belonged to Mars, a few hundred steel golems, a few flying gargoyles, a few witches for Valkyries, and a lady who could not be seen in public. She used her experience to arrange these different people, different soldiers, and different war machines well. In addition to the White Lion Guards and the Nightsong Tigers mercenary group, Brando hoped that the steel golems and gargoyles provided by the Buga people could be hidden, and of course the witches and Valkyries should not be seen in public. Yuta divided the troops into two groups and specially designed a marching route for them. She was very experienced in how to travel in the mountains and not get lost. Many of the routes she designed were used by Brando in the game in his previous life, and Brando was full of praise for them. After more than a week of travel, Brando could completely confirm that it was a waste of talent to let this lady be an infantry leader. Some people were born to be mercenary leaders, elite division commanders, and Yuta was no doubt such a talent. Then Brando looked up at the long line of people on the narrow mountain road. It was mainly made up of 5 carriages. The first carriage in front carried the envoys of Count Eek and Count Janalesu. The second carriage carried the meatball son of Duke Karsuk. The third carriage carried the daughter of Duke Viro and the 7 or 8-year-old little girl of the Grinoires family, and the fourth carriage was the carriage of a certain merchant lady. These carriages were all accompanied by several attendants, and the White Lion Guards, which made the originally narrow mountain road very congested. This was because Brando had wisely placed the hundreds of envoys at the back of the convoy, leaving only a small group of cavalry in front to open the road. Otherwise, they would have blocked the mountain road and would not be able to move. In front of this bloated group, the shadow of a wall had appeared. This wall stretched across the mountain road, and one side of the dark tower was close to the steep mountain wall, and the other side seemed to be hanging over a deep cliff. From afar it was awe-inspiring. This was Fort Tisco, the most important pass from Cipher to Corvado. Brando had been here a few times in the game in his previous life, but because of the presence of players, the atmosphere of the fort in the game was not as solemn as it was in the game. It was much livelier, and he remembered that there was a spontaneous market formed by players on this mountain road. He led Yuta forward through the crowd until they came to the bottom of the wall. Medisha and the Shire were already waiting for them, and there was also the meatball son of Duke Karsuk, who looked like he was rolling on the ground. After so many days, Brando had figured out how to pronounce this guy's awkward name. Avram, or Auguste. When Avram saw Brando, he could not help but complain loudly to him. saying that this remote place was full of ignorant country bumpkins who insisted on seeing the Count in person, and that they did not give him any face at all. Brando had long been immune to this level of complaint, but he still had some doubts in his heart. Generally speaking, these soldiers would not easily offend nobles. After all, in this era, there were not many who dared to pretend to be nobles. According to Avram, either someone was deliberately making things difficult for them, or something had happened in the fort. He cast a questioning look at Medisha and the Shire. The little elven princess frowned and replied softly, "Judging from their tone, it seems like there's a thief in the fort. There are not only soldiers and officers in this fortress, but there are also their families and villagers living nearby. It's not like this place is too big or too small. It's not like there are only soldiers and officers in this fortress. There are also their families and villagers living nearby. It's not like this place is too big or too small. If there's a burglar, then this place has to be guarded for 365 days in a year, and 24 hours a day." However, the Shire was obviously more familiar with the ways of the world. He hurriedly explained with a smile, "My lord, I've asked. I'm afraid that Mr. Avram has misunderstood something. I heard that the thief stole something from the owner of this place. That's why the situation is like this." Brando finally understood. A nobleman, especially a military one, was actually patronized by a thief in his own territory. Anyone would be furious if they were in his place. Although in many of Erwin's village stories, stories about the thief of God and the nightingale were exaggerated to the extreme, and these incarnations of justice seemed to be specifically targeting the nobles. They were chivalrous and they robbed the rich to help the poor. But in fact, those who really understood this business would understand that most of these gray areas that made a living in a certain place were actually inextricably linked to the nobles. This was not to say that the nobles secretly supported these people's work, but it was precisely to protect the nobles' rights and interests from being infringed upon. Most of the time, the nobles were well aware of how many thieves there were in the area, and what the identity of these thieves were. Other than that, the nobles basically minded their own business. Therefore, the person who committed this crime was definitely an outsider. But Brando was curious, and he wondered who was so daring. Soon, the guards verified their identities, lowered the drawbridge and opened the gate, allowing them to enter the fortress. Brando stared at the slowly rising gate, and he knew that the so-called identity verification was just a pretense. Most of the time before this was just to report to the Viscount. The guards below were unwilling to bear the responsibility, so they asked the Viscount to personally let them pass. But what Brando did not know was that the daring bandit he muttered was really a local, and not an outsider. Inside Castle Tisco, 2 carriages were parked under the shade of a tree. Although the so-called shade was only left with a few lonely withered leaves, they still hadn't fallen to the ground. Outside the carriages, there were many servants. At first glance, these servants didn't look like those who came from the countryside. Although they looked bright and clean, they looked lazy at first glance, as if they still had the habit of idling around before they became nobles' servants. These servants were well trained. Their masters did not open the door to get down from the carriage, so they stood in 2 rows in front of the carriages. They did not say a word and looked straight ahead, like 2 rows of puppets that were about to take root on the ground. As for the 2 carriages, the emblem on one had been removed, and the coat of arms on the other was a black wolf. In fact, the wolf emblem alone was enough to stop anyone in Castle Tisk, because it was the emblem of the Grey Mountain family. 2 young people were sitting in the carriage. To be exact, 2 young ladies. One was a 17 or 18 years old noble lady, and the other was a young girl with curly hair under a huge scholar's hat and thick glasses, like an old pedant. However, she was very short like a dwarf, and even her breasts had not started to develop. At first glance it was obvious that she was a real lowly, and judging from her age, she seemed to be no more than 11 or 12 years old. The 2 were obviously talking, but what was surprising was that the one who led the conversation was the little girl who looked like she had not even changed her teeth yet. She said, so slow, I hate people who are not punctual." The noble lady was obviously worried and asked carefully, "Chiara, they seem to have found something missing." "Of course they will find it," the lowly replied matter-of-factly. "That Viscount is not an idiot. But won't we get into trouble? Troublesome? Of course not." Chiara spun a card-like object in her hand and looked at it with interest. I'm just a little interested in this thing. Would he dare to disobey me if I asked him to give it to me? I just don't want to owe him a favor, so I had to do it myself. Besides, things like mistakes and whatnot have not appeared in my dictionary. Chapter 905. While the two were talking, a servant knocked on the carriage door and reported, "Miss, the envoy group has arrived." They entered the city from the Stone Lizard Mountain path. They were delayed for a while because of the martial law. Humph. The little girl knocked on the table in the middle of the carriage and said, "It seems that guy has arrived. Kiara, should we go?" The Count's daughter asked softly, but the little girl's attitude was firm. She quickly shook her head and said, "No, we will wait here. Let me see if that guy is boring." Although the Count's daughter had a gentle look on her face, she was no fool. She could naturally tell that her companion was deliberately making things difficult for the Count. She could also vaguely guess the reason, and could not help but ask more worriedly, "Kiara, this isn't very good." "Why is it not good?" The little girl pretended to be indifferent. "But he is the leader of the envoy group after all." "So what? If that guy dares to scold me with a straight face, I won't go to the Empire." The little girl was very dissatisfied. "You won't go to the Empire?" The Count's daughter showed a shocked expression. "What are you afraid of, Enide? When the time comes, you can stay at my house for a while. I will complain to my brother. Your father won't dare to do anything to us," the little girl replied. The Count's daughter opened her mouth and wanted to say something, but she knew that she could not persuade her companion. She could only sit there uneasily as if she had accepted her fate. The carriage was quiet for a while. The two people each had different feelings as they waited for Brando's arrival. The Count's daughter only hoped that the Count would not vent his anger on her. She was worried about her gains and losses and could not help but be worried for a while. The little girl sitting opposite her did not seem to care. She gently tapped the window with her finger while looking at the scenery outside. After Brando entered the city, he received a message from a servant. He already knew that the representatives of House Cipher and Count Greymountain were already in the city. However, he first arranged for the diplomatic group to stay in an inn in the fortress before heading to the appointed location alone. When he arrived at the agreed location, he saw the two carriages parked under the oak tree from afar, as well as 2 rows of servants standing beside the carriages. He walked over and revealed his identity to these people, thinking that he would be able to see the 2 representatives. However, he did not expect that the servant who passed on the message would walk back the way he came not long after he reached the carriages, bringing back a message with a poker face. The young lady heard that the Count is knowledgeable. In order to prove the Count's identity, she wants to test some of the Count's knowledge. Brando couldn't help but be stunned. Was there something wrong with this noble lady's head? How could she verify one's identity like this? Could it be that the princess's royal ring was fake? He glanced at the carriage and thought to himself, forget it. After all, she is a member of the royal family, even though she is a former royal family, and she is a girl. It's not good to be too calculative. He could only answer patiently, please speak. Chiara's little face was almost pressed against the window. She said with a little pride, I have long heard that the guy boasted of being knowledgeable. The rumors about him in the Southern Territory are amazing. I have seen a lot of people like him. It's just a golden exterior. To them, knowledge is just a disguise and gorgeous clothes. Let me expose his hypocritical appearance. Humph, I will let him understand that the search for the truth is sacred and cannot be profaned. The Count's daughter could almost see herself being punished for bringing trouble to her family. The small house where she was confined swayed in front of her. She asked worriedly, What questions did you ask him, Chiara? Hee. The little girl smiled slyly. She pushed her thick glasses and replied with some pride. Nothing, just some ancient words. Enide stared at her suspiciously. She wondered if her companion would really be so soft-hearted. Sure enough, the little girl said. But these words were found on some stone slabs by a friend of my teacher. In order to unearth those stone slabs, my teacher and I stayed in the cold and boring Balta Plateau for a long time. My teacher is an authority in the field of ancient languages, but even he couldn't recognize all the words on those stone slabs. Just wait and see how that guy embarrasses himself. Enide knew who the little girl's teacher was. She thought that since even the master couldn't recognize all the slabs, It wouldn't be embarrassing even if the Count couldn't recognize them. Of course, she didn't dare to say this out loud, in case the young lady changed her mind at the last minute. Outside the carriage, Brando was taking a piece of paper from the servant. He glanced at the tadpole-like ancient words on the paper and couldn't help but laugh. Isn't this the content of the ancient stone slabs? The first clue of the war slate. These stone slabs were the clues he provided to Tullman, which allowed people to unearth them in advance in this era. It was fine if it was something else, but it just had to be the words on the stone slabs. The words on the stone slabs were once a hot topic on the forum. In the end, it was translated by a level 16 ancient language master in their guild, who wore a +3 language skill divine artifact, Necklace of Knowledge. He could even recite it with his eyes closed. He put down the paper and without even thinking, he said to the servant in front of him, "Tell your mistress that the fragments of the sky fell to the ground with the collapse of the towering pillars." It recorded the whispers in the dust and wind. A few minutes later, Kiara, did the Count guess correctly? Enid looked at her companion worriedly. She had been staring at the contents of the paper for a long time without moving. He didn't guess. The little girl dropped this sentence and jumped out of the carriage. She pushed away the servant who came to support her and hurriedly ran out. Brando didn't expect that the person who came out of the carriage would be such a little girl who seemed to still be in the process of growing her teeth. In standard villain lines, she was a little girl with yellow hair who was still wet behind the ears. The other party was wearing a pair of thick bottle-bottomed glasses that didn't match her cute face. She looked at him with a frown and asked, "Hey, how did you recognize these words? Does she still care about aristocratic etiquette?" "This little lady, may I ask who you are?" Brando was a little unhappy at first, but when he found that the person who tested him was such a little girl, he was no longer angry. No matter how bored he was, he wouldn't be so bored as to argue with a child. Kiara seemed to have realized her rudeness at this time, but she snorted softly and replied, "Count Digiu is my father, Queen Anna is my aunt, my brother is Levin? Or Nessen? Duke Cypher, you should know who I am by now, right? What kind of messy relationship is this?" Brando looked at the arrogant little girl for a while before he sorted out his thoughts and asked, "You are the representative of House Cypher?" "It's the former royal family," the little girl corrected. "More or less, but I don't want to go to the Empire. Can you persuade me?" What a spoiled little girl, Brando thought to himself. He shook his head and said, "I can't persuade you. How about this, you go back first. The eldest son of the king is a generous person. He probably won't blame his sister." "Eh? You're really strange, you actually call my brother the eldest son of the king. It's not proper for you to call him that, you know? Aren't you afraid that the princess will cause trouble for you?" "Oh, I know." The little girl's eyes flashed and she replied proudly, "You don't care about that little princess at all, right? How about you support Levin to take the throne? The House of Covardo has already lost its sword, so it's natural for it to lose the throne. History is a cycle, and the House of Cypher is already at the time of its revival. Besides, my brother is much more powerful than that princess of yours. That little princess only knows how to sell herself for a good price, marry a good husband, and revive the House of Covardo. She's very superficial. The revival of a country can't be decided by just one family. How about it, I promise you that in the future you won't just be a count, but people will call you a duke." If it was someone else who said those words to Brendel, Brendel would have definitely punched that person to the ground, unable to get up. But it was a little lowly with a childish voice who was advising him in such a serious manner. He did not know whether to laugh or cry. This little girl had not even changed all her teeth, but she kept calling Griffine a little lass as if Griffine, who was already 17 years old, was still wet behind the ears in her eyes. "Miss, if you don't want to go to the Empire, I can write a letter for you to prove that you're not feeling well. As for the rest, I'm really not interested in discussing it." Brando could only answer like this. But the little girl didn't seem to appreciate it. She shook her head and said, "I'm fine. I don't need you to write a letter for me. Besides, you haven't told me why you can read those words. I must find a way to figure it out." "All right, as you wish." Brando shook his head. "Didn't you say that you don't want to go to the Empire? How can you go back on your words?" But Chiara seemed to see the disapproving look on his face. She snorted softly and said, "I don't want to go to the Empire, and I want to go to the Empire. There's no contradiction between that. After that, she turned around and ran back to the carriage. She rudely used her hands and feet to climb up the mountain and said loudly to the Count's daughter who was sitting on the carriage, "Enide, I've changed my mind. I'm going to the Empire. You go back alone." "No need, Chiara. I'll go with you." The Count's daughter wanted to cry but had no tears. When did she say that she wanted to go back? But Chiara's words finally made her feel relieved. Fortunately, at least she didn't have to go back home and be confined. Although she didn't know why the young lady suddenly changed her mind, the Count's daughter couldn't help but have an indescribable good impression of the Count Tanagal, whom she had never met before. Thank God Martha was above. She secretly drew a god's mark on her chest. After Chiara and the Count's daughter returned to the team, the people who had been traveling for days enjoyed a rare night in the hotel where they could sleep peacefully. Although the incident of the Viscount being burgled in the city caused an uproar, after all, it had nothing to do with them. Although the guards probably couldn't wait to arrest all the merchants who had some assets in the city, and then claim that they had cooperated to commit the crime, and then confiscate their property, they didn't dare to provoke this team with a strong background. The delegation stayed in Fort Tisco for half a day and a night, and set off early the next morning. It was said that the Viscount didn't find the mysterious burglar until the end, so the area around the Grey Mountain was filled with the legend of a mysterious nightingale for a long time. At first, the image of this nightingale was like that of a god in the sky, but later, no one knew how she got involved with the Count of Tanagal. Some people even swore that they saw the Count steal the Viscount's things with their own eyes, as if he was there when Brando was committing the crime. Over time, the image of this nightingale gradually spread to the image of a wise and astute little girl, but no matter which image it was, what they did was to rob the rich to help the poor, as if they couldn't find anything more meaningful to do every day, regardless of whether they had enough to eat every day. As for the things that the Viscount lost, there were many different opinions. Some said that it was a ton of gold, or a diamond the size of a fist. Some exaggerated said that it was evidence of the Viscount's treason with the enemy. Most of the people who harbored such malicious thoughts had some kind of enmity with the Viscount, but there was a general consensus that these things, if only they could get their hands on them, how good would that be? As it turned out, most people did not have the noble character to be a hero. After leaving Fort Tisco, the diplomatic group headed north, but they did not enter Corvado. Instead, they crossed the border between the Grey Mountain and the Balta Plateau, braving the biting cold wind of the Ironthorn Mountain Road as they approached the kingdom's border day after day. After leaving the Grey Mountain area, there were endless mountains. There were no longer any human settlements in the vast rolling mountains. 3 days later, they passed by the vicinity of Winterclaw Fort. It could be said that they had bid farewell to the last area closest to civilization before reaching the Empire. After that was the snowy region that no one set foot in all year round, a natural forbidden zone between the Empire and the kingdom. Haruz told them some terrible legends about this region, such as the soft sounds in the wind at night were the whispers of the undead on the plateau, and the terrible wolf-like creatures on the plateau. He and his sister had lived in Winterclaw Fort for quite a long time, so he knew some of the local folklore very well. However, these stories scared the ladies in the diplomatic group so much that they did not sleep well for a few nights. After that, Brando and the young prince became unwelcome guests in each carriage. For Brando, it was an unexpected disaster. These days, Chiara had been pestering Brando to find out why he knew the meaning of the ancient words. Of course, Brando could not come up with a lie like, "If you are all cavemen, then I am at least a Homo sapiens from the future." However, during a casual conversation, when the little girl from House Cypher asked about his master, he, as usual, used the excuse that he learned from the Bugas. Unexpectedly, this excuse worked wonders. After that, Chiara disappeared and hid in his carriage with the Count's daughter all day long. It was only later that Brando found out that she was plotting how to steal the knowledge of the Bugas from him. This so-called truth made him want to cry, but no tears came out. The others in the diplomatic group were not as hardworking as the eldest daughter of House Cypher. Except for Iko and the sergeant from Janalesu, most of the noble descendants who lived like princes began to complain since they entered Balta. Then they began to fall ill one after another. The first one was the meatball, Mr. Ephraim. Because he was greedy for some unclean game, of course, he asked his servant to find a way to find it. He began to vomit and have diarrhea. Fortunately, there were still clerics in the diplomatic group who took a day or two to calm him down. Then it was the 7 or 8-year-old little girl from Duke Grinoire's family who had a high fever. In the end, Brando the leader seemed to have played the role of a nanny. Although it sounded good to let the little girl hold his hand and call him brother with teary eyes, the price was that he did not sleep well for a few days. After the diplomatic group crossed the last mountain on the border of Balta, everything seemed to have quieted down involuntarily, because everyone knew that the fortress of the Black Sword was in front of them. Since the beginning of the last era, that was the gateway to the empire, the last checkpoint in the north of the kingdom. Majestic mountains traversed the north and south, connecting the two kingdoms together. In the southeast of the empire there was a huge mountain range, part of the White Mountain Range. This mountain range traversed the entire southern part of Saint-Tassel. At the end of the west, it crossed the southernmost part of the wilderness of the Four Territories, forming an undulating mountain range. In the center of the mountain range there was snow all year round, and there were even many large and small black forests. This was a paradise for archaeologists and explorers. The Direct Mountains were named after the first Wind Elf king. To the west of the mountains was the famous Anzaruta region. This name alone may be confusing, but it had another name, the home of the Highlanders, the home of the Longblade Lords. To the east of the Direct Mountains was the starry Abyssal Sea. Along the coast of the Abyssal Sea were duchies and kingdoms of various sizes. Antiburo was one of them. To the north was the famous wilderness of the Four Territories, the four-leaf grass plains, the birthplace of the Wind Elves and the Cruise people. At the same time it was also the place where the Sacred Covenant was made. The Balta Plateau was just the southern tip of this famous mountain range. The mountain range gradually leveled off in the direction of the Corvado Plains, and together with the eastern end of the Broken Sword Mountains, it formed a famous mountain pass. This was the fortress of the Black Sword. On this day, the diplomatic group finally saw the insignificant fortress between the two peaks from the high ground. But everyone knew that when you really came to the fortress, you would be deeply shocked by the wall that was more than 20 meters tall. That was the Imperial Wall. Oh! Chapter 906. In the wilderness south of Anzaruta and the border between Balta and Anzaruta, most of the undulating ridges only had this kind of dark rock. There was little vegetation, and the higher elevations were covered with white snow all year round. Below there was only sparse Eurasian heather or similar shrubs that formed a tundra grassland, scattered on the ground like a thin layer of volcanic ash. A majestic fortress stood between the two dark mountains. The walls were more than 60 feet high and were made of square stones. The empire's flag fluttered on the 4 watchtowers. From these towering towers, one could easily monitor every valley within a radius of 10 miles. The observation room was also equipped with rotating ballistas and wizards. There was also more than a squadron of crossbowmen, who could shoot the enemy from the air through the holes in the towers. The fortress was also equipped with an air force. The Frontier Legion stationed here had griffins and wyverns, as well as elite Pegasus Knight. They would ascend to the sky as soon as possible after confirming the enemy's situation, guarding the airspace above the fortress. Brando withdrew his gaze from the huge iron cages on the walls. Those were the Griffins' cages. The Griffins locked in them were the air force of the early warning unit on the walls. They could be used for reconnaissance and interception. Not far from those iron cages was a towering giant door. This giant door was more than 50 feet high from the ground to the top. It opened in the middle and was completely made of cast iron. In order to cast this iron door, the crew's craftsmen used pre-cast iron workpieces to assemble it together. The wizards used magic to mix them together. The purpose of casting this iron door was to fully unleash the impact of the dragon cavalry inside the fortress. There were 2 regiments of dragon cavalry inside the Black Sword Fortress. When the crews needed them, they would let the dragon cavalry line up behind the door and open the main door to attack the enemy outside the fortress. The flat slope outside the Black Sword Fortress was also artificially paved. It was originally a steep valley, but it was filled up by Duke Semple and turned into what it was now. Romaine stood beside him, holding his arm tightly with her little hand. She was also looking up at the majestic wall. She slightly opened her mouth and sighed. "It's so high, Brando." The outer walls of the Black Sword Fortress were raised during the Year of Glory. Before that, the main wall was no more than 35 feet high, not much different from the outer walls of Monsteros. During the Year of Frost, the Highlanders led by the Longblade Lord attacked this place with the support of the Erewhon. During the Year of the Tiger Lizard, the crews recaptured this fortress and began to rebuild it. The construction of the stronghold lasted for 30 years. It wasn't until the Year of Summer when Duke simply completed the front ramp that the stronghold was completed. Brando explained to her. This knowledge was not rare for a veteran player, but the little Roman was stunned. She had never heard of this before, but after hearing the words of the person beside her, she felt that Brando was the most knowledgeable person in the world. She was a little proud, but also very curious. Can someone really conquer this place, Brando? This wall is so high, can they climb it? Even though the Black Sword Fortress isn't the strongest fortress in the Empire, it's still one of the best in the southern regions of the Empire. However, this city has indeed been attacked by Aween's people twice in history. The first time was during the war when King Eric helped the Highlanders capture Anzaruta. The second time was more recently, during the Walnut Rebellion about 100 years ago. At that time, the Highland Knights of Balta captured this fortress after repelling the invasion of the Empire. Humph. Kiara seemed to have heard the conversation between the two and snorted softly. That was the time when the Corvado dynasty was at its strongest, but unfortunately, it was still too weak. If it were me, I would not return this fortress to the Kurlets. I would either give it to the Lion Beastmen or the Wind Elves so that the kingdom would not have to face the threat from the north. Brando directly turned a blind eye to the childish talk. He noticed that the other envoys were also curious about this matter. He nodded and replied, "That is indeed the case. The Black Sword Fortress was first built in the Year of Moss of the Chaos Era. It was completed at the beginning of the First Era. In history, it has only been conquered twice, and both times were accomplished by the Erewhon. That is because other countries would not take a detour to attack the Empire from Erewhon's territory." Kiara curled her lips and replied. The fat man, Ephraim, asked curiously, "Leader, do you mean that our Erewhon actually defeated the Empire?" "What do you mean?" Brando was stunned. "What I mean is, leader, how could Erewhon defeat the Empire? You must be mistaken, right?" The fat man said loudly as if he had heard a funny joke. Brando was almost angered to death by his words. He replied snappily, "Why do you think that Erewhon has never defeated the Empire?" He did not even have the strength to look down on this guy's ignorant historical knowledge. Let's not talk about the large and small battles in the past hundreds of years. Although the Crew's empire was strong, they were not invincible. There were many examples of them being defeated by the Erewhon. Less than 5 months ago, he had beaten the Holy Cathedral of Fire and the Empire's expeditionary fleet in Ampere Seal and taught them a lesson. Yet this guy ignored this war. He could not help but feel depressed. He could not help but wonder what this guy, as a descendant of nobles, had learned in Karsuk. However, Ephraim was still stubborn. He spread out his hands and asked, "But the Empire is so big. Erewhon is just a small country at the border. Can't even compare to a province of the Empire. How can we defeat them?" "Commander, I don't believe you when you say that we, the people of Aween, have defeated the Kurlets before. There are many such examples in history. In fact, it's just a small conflict, and they claim it as a great victory. I've seen this kind of thing many times in Karsuk. My friends in the patrol team often do this kind of thing. The glory that the royal family preaches must not be fully believed. It's just to maintain the legitimacy of their rule." Comparing the patrol cavalry of this era to the Highland Knight of the War of Walnut, this idea was very avant-garde. Brando could not help but marvel at this guy's way of thinking. He could not help but answer, "In that case, why do you think we are standing here today representing Erewhon to the Empire? The Kurletzians would never ask their provinces to send envoys to pay tribute to His Majesty." Ephraim obviously did not consider this question. He was stunned by Brando's question and could not help but frown and think hard. At this time, Duke Viro's daughter, the 17 or 18-year-old girl, spoke up. "I think it's because the Empire doesn't need a remote place like Aween. Other than our kingdom, aren't there many other kingdoms and duchies under the Holy Cathedral of Fire? And the Empire hasn't made a move against them either. My teacher often told me that if the Empire had the heart, Erewhon would have become an autonomous region like Anzaruta. By then, we would all be nobles of the Empire. Am I right, Count?" "Yes, my foot. That damn teacher of yours better not let me meet him, Brando said in his heart. But when he looked at the expressions of the other people in the diplomatic group, he found that except for outsiders like the Roman, Medici and Hippamera, most of them seemed to agree with this statement. Of course, those who truly understood the history of the kingdom were excluded. For example, the Shire and Chiara. Both of them had a look of disdain on their faces. What made Brando curious was that he saw a similar look on Yuta's face. At this time, Chiara finally could not hold it in anymore. After all, she was a former member of the royal family. Upholding the legitimacy of the kingdom was also upholding the reputation of her family. She coldly sneered. The war between the Empire and the Erewhon Empire since the end of the Dragon Age was also a good show. It was so that the Erewhon Empire could become independent from the Empire and establish our own kingdom. The nobles of the Cruz Empire are rich in the spirit of helping others. They sent the late King Erewhon Empire out of the wilderness of the Four Realms. We really should thank them properly, right? Her sharp sarcasm startled everyone. Only then did Avram realize that he had somehow offended this young lady. Duke Viro's daughter opened her mouth and finally answered. Isn't that because the Wind Elves are helping us? Brando saw Chiara's little face as dark as the bottom of a pot, and could not help but shake his head. He did not know when the nobles of the kingdom had lost their backbone. During the era when the Highland Knight of Balta still existed, during the year of the Walnut, the empire was never a problem for the Erewhon. The problem was whether the people of Erewhon still dared to fight. That was all. He could not help but think of Ebden. The White Knight's predecessor was a Highland Knight of Balta. Since then, for nearly 100 years, the nobles of Erewhon seemed to have suddenly lost their spirit. They could no longer raise their heads in front of the people of Cruz. But he did not expect the nobles' imagination of the Cruz Empire to be so absurd. When Avram first spoke, he thought that he was just an exception. After all, this guy looked like a scion of a rich family. He was the typical example of an ignorant and incompetent person. But when Duke Viro's daughter opened her mouth to speak, he sensed that something was wrong. Although this little girl usually behaved normally, he could tell that she was a well-educated person. She also knew a lot about foreign affairs and etiquette. She obviously knew about the history of the kingdom, but like Avram, she didn't agree with this history. There were too many differences between this history and what they saw now. He shook his head for the second time and answered his nominal subordinates. Although the empire is strong, it is not without enemies. Although Erewhon is small, the empire cannot spare all its energy to deal with us. The empire has Fanzan in the north, Saint-Tossel and Madara in the east, and Hazel and Toquinen in the west. In the face of so many enemies, it is impossible for the empire to spare the strength of a province to deal with us. Moreover, in the south there is Anzaruda. Since the time of the Longblade Lord, the Highlanders have dreamed of independence for nearly 7 centuries. The empire should be thankful that we do not make trouble for them. How would they dare to make a move in the south? Therefore, the empire actually wants to maintain this relationship with us. On the one hand, they are still unwilling to acknowledge the establishment of Erewhon because of the honor of the empire. On the other hand, they are unable to really make a move in the south. Even in the War of Walnut, our opponent was only the Duke of Walnut. In the end, we were actually helping the empire to quell the rebellion. Erewhon's position is so sensitive and special that the Wind Elves and the empire do not dare to act rashly. Relying on this delicate balance, the late King Eric found his own path that belonged to Erewhon. At this point he glanced at Chiara. Anson I has obviously understood the secret between them. That is why he returned the Black Sword Fortress to Cruz after the War of Walnut. Because once the balance is broken, it may not be a good thing for Erewhon. Brando looked at the others and said word by word. So Erewhon does not necessarily need to defeat the entire empire, but this does not mean that Erewhon has no chance of winning. Big countries have the power of big countries, and small countries have the wisdom of small countries. I am telling you all this because I want you to understand that the kingdom of Erewhon has its own unique advantages. Its nobles and people do not need to be enemies in front of the empire. After hearing this, Chiara could not help but snort softly. Obviously, she already knew this knowledge and did not need Brando to repeat it. As for the others, including Avram and Duke Viro's youngest daughter, most of them were hearing this for the first time, so they were skeptical. However, Brando did not need them to believe him completely. He just wanted to give these nobles a heads up in advance, so that they would not lose face when they saw the Empire's nobles. As the group was talking, they gradually approached the Black Sword Fortress. It was at this time that a loud noise came from the front, attracting everyone's attention. The noise started with a row of neat footsteps, followed by the sound of heavy horse hooves. Then, everyone saw a small group of Empire soldiers appear in their field of vision. This small group of Empire soldiers was led by 3 or 4 knights. They opened the small wooden gate beside the huge Black Sword Fortress gate, lowered the drawbridge and rushed out. The few knights shouted and suddenly ordered their men to rush towards a caravan outside the fortress. It was worth mentioning that at this time of the year, other than Brando's eye-catching group of nobles, there were also many caravans of various sizes gathered outside the fortress. As one of the only 2 gateways between the Empire and Erewhon, the Black Sword Fortress was not only a strategic military point, but also an important transportation route between the 2 countries. Throughout the year, except for the 1 or 2 months after the winter harp month when the mountain path was completely frozen, there would be caravans passing through the fortress most of the time. At this moment, the target of the Empire soldiers was obviously the Erewhon caravan. They quickly rushed into the middle of the caravan and first knocked down the armed guards. Then they chased the merchants out of the caravan, tied their hands behind their backs, and pushed them to the ground. After that, the Empire soldiers returned to the middle of the caravan and used their field swords to cut the ropes on the carriages and threw the goods on the ground one by one. Not long after, they found a lot of people from the carriages. There were men and women, old and young. The Empire soldiers herded these people together. Most of these people were dressed in ragged clothes, shivering in the cold wind. The women and children among them were so scared that they cried loudly. However, the Empire soldiers were still indifferent, and a few of them even had a sneer on their faces. At first, Brando thought that he had encountered a melodramatic scene, but he soon realized that it was not the case. But before he could say anything, the Count's daughter behind him was already scared out of her wits. Miss Enide looked at the scene with a pale face and couldn't help but ask in fear, "What the hell is going on?" Seeing this scene, Chiara pursed her lips but was unwilling to speak. Among all of them, Duke Viro's daughter was more knowledgeable. She explained to the others in a low voice, "These people are refugees. So that's how it is." Brando finally understood. Ever since Erewhon's royal faction lost power in the Frost upheaval, the kingdom had been in turmoil. This turmoil in the entire kingdom was manifested in the chaos of war. The struggle between the royal family and the local nobles was only a small part of it. When the central government gradually lost its binding power, the conflicts between the local lords became the first to become acute. Whether it was for the sake of competing for territory, population, or support, large and small wars always continued. This situation was not so intense in the south. On one hand, it was because of Madara. On the other hand, after the Battle of Ampere Seal, the north was temporarily assigned to the eldest son of the king. North of Cipher, the nobles seemed to have lost their order for a while. In these areas that were under the influence of the royal family of Covardo, the royal family of Cipher, the Wind Elves, and the Holy Cathedral of Fire, war seemed to have become a daily necessity. And with the war came a large number of refugees. A small number of these refugees were accepted by Tanajil, but more of them flowed to the north, to the Empire. For the Empire, this was not a big deal. The refugees needed to find a place to provide them with a livelihood, and the Empire was happy to accept this labor force. But the problem was, with the increasing number of refugees, not only did it bring benefits to the Empire, but it also brought troubles and burdens. The direction where the refugees migrated to originally had residents, and the nobles of the Empire could not accept all the laborers. The remaining idle people gradually became a hidden danger to the local public security. Coupled with the fact that the arrival of these refugees harmed the interests of the local residents, over time, these refugees became synonymous with unwelcome in the Empire. Since then, the people of Cruz began to refuse to accept these refugees into the country. What was happening in front of them was obviously such a scene. "Sister, what will happen to them?" Among all of them, the youngest Loli of the Grinoires family looked at the scene with some fear and asked, "They will be treated as thieves and vagabonds, tied to a pillar here and shown to the public, and then driven back." The descendants of the Erewhon nobles showed some embarrassment on their faces. What a disgrace! The face of the kingdom has been lost by these lowly people. Avram could not help but mutter angrily. No wonder the nobles of the empire always act superior in front of us.